Amma Kristen, good to be with you. We're about to start this 3-hour town hall in just a couple of moments as soon as we finish with you here on television. So I encourage everyone who would like to take part in this to turn to our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, as well as our website to take part in this town hall. You know, part of our effort to build a better Bay Area means focusing on the housing issue, which, as we all know, is at a bit of a tipping point and a crisis point in the Bay Area because it has just become so darn expensive and it is making life very difficult for a lot of people. We're not going to solve the housing problem in the next 3 hours, of course, but I can tell you what we will do. We will understand it a great deal better as we go in depth. I have a terrific panel of experts here with me. I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. They literally have an incredible depth of knowledge across a broad spectrum, whether it's government and different agencies. And I'm going to start just very quickly with you, Ken Kirky, the Planning Director of the Association of Bay Area Governments. What do you hope that we can deal with in the next 3 hours that will help people understand exactly how this problem is affecting so many people and what solutions we might realistically be able to achieve?
I think one of the things that folks who've been working on the housing issue and dealing with it day to day have come to realize is there's no one silver bullet solution. We have to produce a lot more housing at all income levels, but especially affordable housing for the workforce. We have to preserve some of our existing affordable housing, and we have to protect people from displacement. We can't choose one or the other, and we can't just have housing built in some communities. We really have to have the region moving forward together.
And I think a key word you just used is region, because one city can't solve it on its own. All right, thank you very much, Ken. We look forward to hearing from all of our experts here on television and also across all of our platforms. This housing town hall is getting underway, and we want to take your questions. So if there's something that you want asked and you want me to direct to one of these experts, please go to our Facebook page at abc7news.com, our website at abc7news.com, as well as our Facebook page, ABC7News, and let me hear from you. Amma Kristen, we'll get underway here in the conference room on the second floor, but for the moment, we'll go back to you in the studio. The town hall meeting here on our platforms. We're on Facebook, our website, and on YouTube. I appreciate you tuning in, and we want to hear your questions. We hope to give you some real answers and to help foster a greater understanding of just exactly what this problem is going to take, what it's going to take to solve this problem over a long period of time, because we can't solve it quickly. We got into this mess over decades, and it will take us a while to get out of it. Part of the problem, we're a victim of our own success in the Bay Area, I suspect. Let me introduce you to the panel of experts that we should Bay Area governments. Ken, great to have you with us.
Great to be here, thank you.
Next to Ken is Elizabeth Kneebone, a research director at UC Berkeley Turner Center for Housing Innovation. And I'm going to ask you as we go along to explain a little bit more about what you do there, Elizabeth, but welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Glad to have you here. Next is Mary Ann. Mary Ann Leshin is the Deputy Director of Housing and Community Development in Oakland, and Oakland has been on fire in the last couple of years, so we want to talk about that. Mary Ann, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Jim Wunderman, on my right, CEO of the Bay Area Council. Jim, I've known for a while. Good to have you, Jim. Thanks for being in here.
Thanks for having me.
Judson True, Director of Housing Delivery, San Francisco. Judson, great to have you with us. we want to understand exactly what housing delivery means.
Absolutely. So, good to be here, Dan.
Thank you so much. And finally, Cynthia Parker, the President and CEO of Bridge Housing. Cynthia, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate that very much. I'm going to start, I think, with, let's just go around the horn and do a bit of an overview without just your individual perspectives from your various agencies and disciplines, and give me a sense of your sense of where we are in terms of the housing crisis, if that's not too strong a word, in the Bay Area. Ken, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm the planning director of actually the Association of Bay Area Governments and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and I would say we're about in as bad a spot as we could be. I've been working in this field for a while, and I think the combination of a lack of production, the benefit of a lot of job growth, combined with the fact that jobs and housing are largely happening in different places. There's been more housing built away from where the jobs are happening. That's put tremendous pressure on our transportation system, and everyone who gets on the freeway in the morning or hops on a train or a bus experiences this every day. And a lot of it is just about people trying to find a place they can afford and get to the job that they have. And there's interest in solutions, and I think there's a lot of people working on solutions, but we haven't begun to turn the corner yet on putting things in place that could really change the trajectory we're on.
Okay, all right, very good. Thank you for that. Elizabeth Kneebone, Research Director, UC Berkeley Turner Center for Housing Innovation. First, tell me, if you will, what that means. What do you do in housing innovation? What's the focus?
So we're a research and policy center at University of California, Berkeley, that is focused on ways that, with all of our research and policy work, what we're looking for are ways that public policy actors and private sector innovators can use housing to help improve outcomes for people in communities. So that means coming to grips with the crisis that we're facing in the Bay Area and thinking about who are all the various actors and the levers that need to be pulled to begin to start to bend the curve, right? To begin to really start coming to grips with this very complicated crisis. And I really appreciated Ken's opening statement there about how nuanced and complicated this is, and often housing is such a personal and important issue to every family and community that very quickly you can lose the nuance, right? And how multi-layered and complicated it is. So it's really trying to, in our work, trying to bring data and understanding and engagement with private sector actors, policy folks, residents, to help bring data and evidence behind what's driving the trends that we've seen and what could really help start moving us in a better direction.
So really your focus, Elizabeth, is to sort of collate and marshal all of the information that's available and put it together in a sensible way that provides real information for decision makers.
Right, and to fill information gaps, because there's just a lot that we don't know in some of these questions because of lack of data, and just needing to really bring a better, more quantitatively driven understanding to these discussions.
Just out of curiosity, give me one example of an area that there isn't data.
Right.
I'm just interested.
Like rents. Like, we want to understand exactly how much an individual unit or a resident in a unit
It's
is
hard to get a good
experiencing.
number on that, isn't it?
That's
I tried
right.
the other day, and it's not easy.
That's right, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction how much that's even being tracked or whether it's being tracked. Publicly available data is lagging, and it's often at a scale that makes it hard to really understand, building by building or neighborhood by neighborhood changes. So that kind of understanding, that sort of data would be really important to better crafting solutions or understanding the impact of solutions like rent control or rent regulations, or where in fact we've seen the biggest price increases and for what kinds of residents and places and communities. So that's the sort of thing that we're trying to just bring a better understanding to where these local nuances are and what we can do to affect them.
All right, great, Elizabeth. Thank you. Marianne Leshin, the Deputy Director of Housing and Community Development in Oakland. Give us, from your perspective, obviously in Oakland, but wider view, what you see the issues being.
Well, I'll start with Oakland. It has over the last 5 to 10 years undergone just massive shifts in the marketplace for housing. So we've seen since 2011, rents increased by 60%, sales prices doubling and continuing to increase, although rents are beginning to stabilize a little bit now. And then the homeless issue is just
Shocking.
Yeah, it's really jaw-dropping and hugely concerning. The point-in-time count that just was released showed a doubling of homelessness in the last 2 years since the last point-in-time count, and actually since...
Wait, let me say, Marianne,
Sure.
doubled in 2 years, the homeless population.
Right, it's now at about 4,000 individuals.
Wow, that is
what's
shocking, isn't it?
estimated. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, please.
And as a long-time Oaklander, I have to say the visual experience of just living and driving to go grocery shopping or to work or to visit friends, it's like a different place.
Yeah.
So those are the things that we're facing in Oakland, and in some ways I think we're experiencing a little bit of the the victim of your own success syndrome. Certainly San Francisco, experienced a lot of that sort of, shifts in the marketplace that have changed the face of San Francisco. And we're seeing the same thing in Oakland.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Oakland, the business community is thriving, restaurant community is thriving, companies are moving in. It's all good, except there's a downside.
Right, exactly. So You know, I like a lot of people, enjoy all the new restaurants and bars, but it breaks my heart that my son cannot afford to live in Oakland.
Right.
As a young adult. But I think the regionalism issue, I'm glad that you raised it as your, you know, part of your opening remarks, because I think that's part of how we get to the solutions. I think Oakland, and I'll be excited to talk about it as the conversation moves along, has a pretty good roadmap right now, but we need to really accelerate the pace and then, you know, link it to what's happening in the region.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Mary Ann. Jim Wunderman, CEO of Bay Area Council. Jim, you obviously, like everyone here at this table, are tapped into all of the governments and all the experts and all the agencies and corporate America as well. How would you encapsulate this issue we're dealing with?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me and stating at the outset that, you know, we're not going to solve this overnight, because we didn't create it overnight. If you look back in modern history in the Bay Area, we built a lot of housing over the course of a few generations, especially coming out of World War II, and then we just plain stopped. Around 1980, it dropped off completely. And so in a lot of ways, the way we look at this is this is a problem, I think, well described by Ken. The level of the crisis can't be understated, and it's a self-inflicted wound. Mm-hmm. We did everything we could as a place, as a state, as a region, to get in the way of housing being constructed over a long period of time now, a couple of generations. And, you know, the effect is what you would expect anytime you have a serious shortage of supply, is you're going to see big price spikes. Obviously, when you combine that with a pretty successful economy, it's been a cyclical economy, but, you know, certainly in the last decade, very successful economy, just couldn't absorb the pressure from this intense shortage, which sometimes gets masked during the periods of recession. You know, at this point, you know, we represent and have for many years employers from around large employers from, you know, throughout the entire Bay Area, and 201, you know, they are feeling really threatened by the inability to recruit people, to retain people. Millennials, if you come up on a couple of millennials and they don't know you're overhearing their conversation, they're talking about moving to another place. Bay Area Council poll 3 years in a row, 34%, 40%, 46%, this year 49% of people in the Bay Area, all people, are thinking about leaving in the next few years. It's a terrifically bad statistic.
We've done a lot of reporting on this, and where years ago, nobody wanted to leave the Bay Area. Yeah. We loved it here, and now I hear it all the time as a reporter, I hear it, and also friends, you know, that I talk to, and I've actually had a number of friends who have left.
It's a topic of conversation everywhere, and we've been working on this forever. In fact, you know, one of the things we're proud of is a few decades ago, we actually created Bridge Housing, the first really important affordable housing provider, because it's always been important for us to be able to get behind this issue and find solutions. But we haven't found many lately. It's been really tough. Now, the numbers in the last couple of years, and I think Oakland's a great example, and San Francisco too, you know, I think people are really focused on this. I think the cities are kind of getting with it. And really trying, and you know, in the last couple of years, we've actually achieved the numbers that ABAG has said we need to achieve each year over a long period of time. Although we probably think the numbers wasn't set high enough in the first place, but it's in the high 20,000s of permits that have been issued over the last couple of years. Now this year, you know, I think we just saw the story that, you know, that number dropped off, I think, in every county except San Francisco. Right, so right. We're really wrestling with a myriad of challenges to the development cycle, the costs, the ability to slow down, stop a project, labor costs, the community response to anything that happens at scale. And you know, this has been going on for a long time, and so we kind of need to get over this and really, as a community, come together and deal with, you call it properly, a crisis. It's every bit that.
Okay. Thank you for using that word, because that's what we hear over and over again from a lot of people. We're going to dig deeply into a lot of this, specifically other things you just said, Jim, but I do want to challenge one thing that you just said out of curiosity. And I want to get back into why around the 80s we slowed down. We'll do that in a moment. But what I want to challenge is this notion that we are just not building enough housing and apartments and homes. Mm-hmm. It seems to me as if we're building all over the place, and every time we throw up a new apartment building, it's a $3,400 rent apartment building. We've been building, it seems to me, a reasonable amount, but even in outlying areas, go to Pittsburgh, Martinez, in the East Bay, those communities, we've been building, new apartments seem to be popping up everywhere, but they're all expensive. I don't see the price going down with more apartments.
So you said it best when you introduced the show, saying that we couldn't overcome this overnight. And that's the problem, is if you can't overcome it, you have to accept the fact you still have to start. The problem is supply. No matter how you want to look at it, the problem is the shortage of supply over the course of about 2 generations. And now we're about 2 years, 3 years into building. And so we are building a lot. We've done well the last couple of years, but it's not well enough to be able to initially impact. Now, in some communities, we are seeing a softening of prices in places where significant building. In fact, in Mission Bay in San Francisco, for a while, we saw very high demand, incredible place to live, all kinds of jobs. But landlords were offering a month or 2 free rent in order to entice renters. We hadn't seen that in years. It's a function of having a lot of construction happening at the same time. There's a lot being built, but it isn't enough. And if you go to some other cities, Seattle's an example, you'll see a lot more cranes, a lot more intensity, and it may not be enough there either. So, we are playing serious catch-up here, and it's going to take a while. We have to be patient, and we have to have policies in place that make sense to solve a long-term problem, not with short-term solutions. We've got to do all the things, all the plays in the playbook need to be called here.
Okay, yeah, it's just so interesting. That's great explanation, because every time I see an apartment go up, I'm always stunned at the rent. I don't see rent prices going down in some of these communities. Judson Shrew, Director of Housing Delivery in San Francisco. First, why aren't you delivering more housing?
I am working as hard as I can every day for Mayor Breed and the people of the city and county of San Francisco to get more housing delivered.
Tell me what you do about it.
Absolutely. So I'm the first person to hold this position. Mayor Breed decided that it was important. Mayor Lennon Breed here in San Francisco decided it was important to have someone who's singularly focused on working across all of the departments within city government to make sure that we're doing everything we can to get housing built.
So what is that? Permits?
Yeah, permits. It's policy, it's permits, it's coordination between city departments and with outside actors that need it. And I feel both blessed and challenged to have such a strong charge from her and such a wide portfolio. Right. I can wake up every day and work in a lot of different directions.
You're not going to be out of work anytime soon.
No. I think we have a lot of housing to deliver. I agree completely with what's been said, that we're decades into a crisis of underbuilding, and that it's going to take a while to get out of that. And we are building. We have seen some increase in housing over the last several years, but even in San Francisco last year, we have a goal. Mayor Breed set a goal, and of having a 5,000 new units of housing a year, and my charge from her is to get that done, and with a third of them being affordable housing. And last year we only produced 2,300 in San Francisco in 2018. So we have about 8,500 units under construction now that we'll be finishing over the next several years.
Judson, are those apartments, condos,
single-family
homes?
They're a mix.
All of them.
We have various breakdowns of them, but they're a real mix of condos and rental units. We do see times in the market where folks are turning more towards condos, and then times when they're leaning more towards rentals. But fundamentally, we know it's not enough, and we need to do better. And we actually do have thousands of units in San Francisco that have been approved that have various challenges to getting built. Some of them are in large-scale projects, which I do want to spend some time talking about today, that people maybe they kind of know that there are some of these projects in San Francisco, like Treasure Island or the Candlestick, where obviously the football stadium used to be, and we actually have the potential to add tens of thousands of units in those locations, but they take a tremendous amount of work up front on the what we call horizontal infrastructure, the streets, the utilities, to really make the neighborhood.
To develop the
exactly, to get all that done, and that involves a lot of work between the city departments and outside utilities and others, and it's been really challenging. We're actually working closely with Bridge on a complete rebuilding of one of our large public housing projects in San Francisco through Hope SF, called Potrero Hope SF, and we're very excited about that.
Judson, fascinating what you're doing, and there were 2 quick follow-ups before we move on. What is the training you have? Are you a construction guy? Or I'm
really a policy person who's worked in and around local and state government for 15 years, and I like to think of myself as a problem solver and somebody who can understand both systems and people, because that's what provides outcomes for us in government. We have, working with the public, I work across the departments. I'm working directly with department heads, with engineers, with the outside developers, both affordable and market rate. And I think my goal is to bring people together to try to figure out what the pain points are and what the blockages are, and figure out how to work through those, and not just on an individual project, but on a systems level. We have a responsibility to make government work better to deliver the housing we need.
And Judson, let me ask you just one more follow-up. We're awash in money in the Bay Area. We're so fortunate in this community. Why are we so far behind in terms of building? It seems like with a shortage, developers would be rushing in all around the Bay Area to build housing.
Right.
What's the problem?
I think there are two answers to that. One, on the affordable housing side, we need to devote as many public resources as we can to building subsidized affordable housing in the Bay Area. Since taking office about a year ago, Mayor Breed has directed about $1 billion towards funding affordable housing, including a $600 million housing bond that's on the ballot this November. So. And that housing is expensive, so we need to make sure we're directing as many resources as we can, but we really haven't begun to scratch the surface of how much we need. In general, it's also, as much as the Bay Area has a lot of wealth and a lot of challenges and a lot of poverty, it's incredibly expensive to build housing here. We have a long, complicated processes, and the cost of construction has gone up dramatically as we've started to see a little more building. It's hard to find the firms and the general contractors, the subcontractors who can get out there and get the work done, and the people, the workers. And that's a huge challenge. Some studies have shown that we have the most expensive construction market in the world. In the world. And in the world. I mean,
and you can't fly a kite around here without a permit. I mean.
No, there are many permits.
All right, thanks, Judson. Cynthia Parker, President and CEO of Bridge Housing. We've touched on it. Jim mentioned it. Judson mentioned it. And Judson, I know, is working with you as well. Give us first of all, give us an idea of what Bridge Housing is all about.
Sure, absolutely. Well, Bridge is a developer of affordable housing. We've been around for actually not 2 decades, Jim, but three.
You're a for-profit developer?
We're a nonprofit developer, but we do all sorts of housing on the spectrum of income. So the property that Justin mentioned that we are involved in at Potrero Hill, it's a redo of a decrepit public housing site that will soon have 1,650 units in it that will be everything from market rate housing to for housing the formerly homeless, plus allowing people who are in the public housing right now suddenly live in some very nice units, whereas before they've been in some very decrepit units. We have a very substantial amount of building going on within the Bridge system. We're headquartered here in San Francisco, but we're actually throughout California and actually Washington and Oregon as well. But we have about, I'd say, almost 9,000 units in our pipeline right now. In our pipeline,
in the Bay Area or California?
Just in California, and in the Bay Area, about 6,000 units of housing. So we've got about $1.5 billion under construction, and it ain't easy, as said. Where the rubber hits the road is what I'm doing. We're on the ground, we're hiring the contractors, we're putting the capital stack together. We're actually owning the units and providing services to the residents.
Bridge Housing is owning the
units.
units.
That's correct.
That's a big financial undertaking. Where does the money come from?
From a variety of places. The subsidy sources, as Justin mentioned, comes from localities, also from the tax code. We use tax incentives for housing tax credits. We're using a new program called the Opportunity Zone to invest in some of this housing right now. We're, what's interesting about affordable housing is that the system is incredibly complex. And so I can't just go and get a bank loan and build a housing unit and be able to build it and rent it to someone who is making, $14 an hour or $10 an hour. Some of the people who are living on Social Security who desperately need housing are making, literally a few $100s a month. And so what I need is subsidy to subsidize the capital that we bring into the buildings so that I can rent them for less.
Okay, and that money has to come from somewhere, obviously.
It does.
All right, thanks, Cynthia, very much. I want to encourage, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, or our website. I'd love to be able to pass along to our panelists here your questions, abc7news.com. Just go to our Facebook page as well, ABC7 News. Wherever you're watching us, you can reach us, but Facebook may work very well for you to give us your questions, because I'd love to be able to get your input. This is a conversation, not just among me and these experts, but among you, and we're really trying to find some real solutions here, and also just to develop a real understanding of the complexity of the problem, which you can gather just from this introductory comment section. The complexity is pretty heavy duty, and it's not easy to solve. I mean, it's easy to go, just build more housing. Well, that's not easy to do. Let me go back to you, Ken, and you talk about a lack of production and also the job growth. And Mary Ann, and you guys all jump in too. Don't wait for me, and if you want to pounce on something that was said or follow up, please do. But job growth, certainly what we talk about in Oakland and in San Francisco, you hear this term a lot, the gentrification of these communities, and it's been fabulously lucrative and productive for these communities, particularly Oakland and San Francisco, but all around the Bay Area, to see jobs just exploding, companies moving in, all these restaurants opening, millennials walking everywhere, spending a lot of money. But the downside, of course, is it's displacing a lot of people and pricing out a lot of people who have lived here for a long time but simply no longer can afford to. It's always shocking to me, even if you earn a pretty good living, it's really tough to make ends meet around here. I mean, really tough. Now, if you work for minimum wage or a little above minimum wage, it's all but impossible. Talk a little bit about the lack of production and
Sure.
why it's such a big deal. Why it's been decades in the making, and why it's so hard to fix.
Well, I think going back to Jim's comment about going back to the 1980s, up until that point, we still had pretty big swaths of the Bay Area where there was a lot of development going up on what planners called greenfield, so land that was undeveloped, along 580 and 680 and Highway 4 and so forth. Around the 1980s is when we started to tap out of that amount of land, and also a lot of counties outside of San Francisco and the Bay Area said, we don't want to sprawl. We want to protect our beautiful scenic and natural resources. And I think that's something that most people in the Bay Area really appreciate. It kind of defines what the place is to a certain extent. I think the problem is at the same time we were doing that, we made infill development and development within our existing communities more difficult, arguably, than any place else in the country. We have...
How so, or why?
Well, as Judson touched on, we have, processes at the state level, a whole environmental process that applies to developments that might require very little very little driving for the people that move in there. So they're therefore good for the environment. But there's still a whole process those projects need to go through that costs a lot of money, results in a lot of time. Time is money for developers. We have a tax structure with Prop 13, which is the third rail, but somebody's got to say it around this table, that essentially incentivizes...
Everybody move away from Ken.
It essentially incentivizes commercial development and makes residential development something most communities making some rational decisions don't want to do. Commercial development pays for itself, residential development less so. And then you have a dynamic in a lot of communities where there is a feeling, I think, among some residents that they don't see the big picture. Sort of as you said earlier, they see development happening here and there, but they don't see prices going down. They just see another car in front of them on the street or another person crowding their bus. So they're not showing up to meetings and supporting those elected officials who are kind of fighting the good fight to get projects approved. We've just, as you've said, as others have said, we've built this up over decades, but I think it really goes back to saying we didn't want to sprawl. Arguably that's a good thing, but we made it really, really difficult to do anything else. And it's kind of fed upon itself over time, including the construction cost piece, where to get the workers, you have to pay them enough money to live here, so there aren't enough workers, so you're driving up the cost of housing, and it just goes on and on and on.
It's a cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's for years in the 50s, after World War II, we were all encouraged to move to the suburbs, and California, big car country, we all moved to the suburbs. And then the last few years, people have been moving back in to the cities, but it's become so incredibly expensive. Yep. And as you say, now we have, there are transportation issues because the transportation didn't keep up with all of the suburban building that we did. And now we have a situation where everything is squeezed to the maximum, and transportation is stretched thin. Development, as you say, out in the suburbs, it's limited to some degree, and we keep trying to go a little bit farther out. Now people are commuting from the Central Valley sometimes here. Mary Ann, I'd love you to talk a little bit about, you mentioned figuring out what levers need to be pulled. What levers do need to be pulled?
Well, I think one of the things that hasn't come up yet, and it's an comment, is about the subsidy piece that Cynthia referenced, because to build housing that's affordable to people with low incomes requires subsidy. A bank loan isn't going to do it. And I think, another trend that we've seen, starting pre-1980, but certainly since then, has been a federal government backpedaling from being a participant in subsidizing housing, whether it's through capital dollars or Section 8, which...
Backpedaling. They're pulling away from that.
So they're pulling away
Okay.
from participating financially in this endeavor. So then it leaves it to the state and local government to step in, which the state has stepped in big time of late, but stepped away for a while. So that's been kind of, I think there was a period where we didn't have any state funds available. Now we do. And then at the local level, we're seeing more and more localities, just as Judson described that bond that San Francisco is looking at. Oakland did have a bond approved a couple years ago for affordable housing, which serves as that subsidy piece. So I think that when you think of levers, that's one of the things we have to be looking at, is how to generate that kind of funding. Seattle has had a housing levy for a long time where people agreed to tax themselves to pay for that kind of subsidy.
Does it work in Seattle?
I think
Is
they're...
it making a difference?
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
I used to be the housing director for Seattle.
Okay.
So I passed the housing levy one year when I was there.
Well, then you would know.
Yeah, I do know
There you
things
go.
about it. We also have an office up there.
Yeah.
And it is working, but Seattle's also suffering from very similar pressures that we are in San Francisco. Amazon is there. There are other big tech companies there.
Lots of
They
great
are
high-paying jobs.
A lot of great high-paying jobs, record homelessness. So it's really, I go from here to there, and really I see no difference on the streets. The cost of building housing is just a smidge cheaper in Seattle than it is in San Francisco. But the fact that there is a renewed commitment through a levy process to just renew the levy is a big commitment. In San Francisco, we have to get the mayor and the board of supervisors, they have to get geared up and then amass a campaign just to do a bond measure. So it's a little bit different. If we had a permanent source, it might be helpful.
Interesting. Okay, but so just to backtrack on that question, is that making a difference, the tax in Seattle? Do you think has it had a real impact yet?
Oh, absolutely. That levy has
The levy has
Right.
helped, even though the problem is still pretty serious?
Well, they're experiencing growth as we are, so just the explosion of jobs, but it is a continued commitment, and it is producing, the levy in and of itself is probably producing about 5,000 units every couple of years.
Okay, all right. And I want to encourage people to send in your questions, please, because I want you to be able to get your questions answered by these experts that we've assembled here, because there's a lot of great information, a real wealth of knowledge and experience in this room. So please, on our Facebook page, ABC7 News, or our website, abc7news.com, send in your questions, and we have some folks standing by to make sure I get those questions so that I can put them to our experts here. We're going to pause for a moment, stay with us online, and go back on television and do a little update on TV. So we'll do that in just a moment. So I'm going to pause for just a moment so I make sure I hear it when Amma and Kristen toss it over to me. Coming up here in a moment. Thank you for bearing with us online. Hi, Kristen. We're really having a terrific discussion here for the next few hours on all of our platforms online, and I hope people will tune in and send me questions because I'd love to give them the chance to have those questions answered. We really have an absolutely fabulous panel here, and we've been having a very interesting discussion. I'll quickly turn to one of our panelists, Judson True, who's the brand new Director of Housing Delivery in San Francisco. That's a new position created by Mayor London Breed. Housing delivery means exactly what the name implies, delivering housing, and you've been tasked with trying to find 5,000 new houses a year. Is that correct?
To try to work through the city process and policy issues and permitting to try to make sure that we can get those units built each year for all the people who need to live here. It's a huge challenge. I think we hit just over 5,000 a few years ago coming out of the as the economy recovered after the Great Recession, but we have to do it. I mean, we really have no choice. We can't solve the Bay Area's housing crisis alone in San Francisco, but we can show the way for what it's going to mean to get that kind of housing built. And we do want to make sure that at least a third of those housing units are affordable, because we're really in danger of losing our teachers, our middle class, our workers, and it's a huge crisis.
All right, and very quickly, Cynthia Parker is the president and CEO of Bridge Housing, which is a nonprofit developer of affordable housing. And we were just talking online, Cynthia, about the challenges that Seattle is also facing. They passed a levy to subsidize housing, and they're still having the same kind of issues that we are. Huge job growth, huge housing shortage.
That's right. I think I was really commenting that Seattle and San Francisco are in very similar places. People in Seattle say they don't want to be like San Francisco, but of course they're both beautiful cities, and they both have enormous job growth that's occurring, and also not keeping pace with the delivery of housing.
All right, thanks very much. Again, getting a sense of this great group of people that have so much knowledge. Want to hear your questions? Please send them to us on Facebook. The town hall continues online, but Amma and Kristen will send it back to you. We're not going to solve the housing crisis, but we are going to understand it a great deal better over the next few hours. Back to you guys. You bet. Okay.
If you want some questions, I have some.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it. Josh, by the way, is our assistant news director. Kind to be here with us today. These are some questions from our viewers who are watching online. Here's a question for Rebecca, from Rebecca. How do you feel with the NIMBY, not my backyard problem? Every time a good housing idea is proposed in San Jose, the NIMBYs come out in force and stop the proposal. Anybody? And we can all relate, you know, depending, I suppose, on what's going on. But anyone want to tackle that?
Anywhere you look in the Bay Area, I mean, this is the issue. Is there's a whole slew of tools that people have to either slow down or stop housing from happening. And I don't have the data, but I have the suspicion that if half the housing that had been rejected in the last generation was actually built, you'd have had a different show today on a different subject. So, you know, this is really common. I think we all bore witness to the front page story a couple of weeks ago about San Bruno, in which the developer, worked with the city, had a high percentage of affordability, did all the things the city wanted, and still in the end was rejected. In Cupertino, a group has been trying to replace the Valco Mall, which is really unnecessary, people haven't used in a long time, and has a great project there. There's lots of supporters for it, people who'd like to live there, and they went through a process that was enabled through state law and did that and got the approval, and now that one's in court. Brisbane, just south of San Francisco, basically an old garbage dump from a different time, my whole career was just received approvals, but I think it was 20, 30 years, one proposal after the next, and the city of Brisbane, which only has a population of a few thousand, wanted to eliminate all of the housing. They were willing to have the commercial there for the reasons I think that Ken described, and I think we should focus on the fact you don't want to just blame the cities, because cities have a mission, and the fact that it's so unhelpful to a city when a housing development gets approved. They don't get a financial benefit. There are financial costs. It puts pressure on the schools. It puts pressure on the roads. It shouldn't. Housing should be incentivized, and a city should look for opportunities to do it because it's good for their bottom line. And it used to be that way, but in Prop 13, the real estate tax then went up to the state. And so, we're still bad, and that's around the time when we stopped building. So, this is a case where it's really easy for people who live in a community to come out, essentially intimidate a city council. It's hard to get the people who support the housing because they don't own it yet. They're the future,
Right.
They're the future group that would be there. And so you get a whole bunch of people, very well organized, very passionate, wearing some colored shirt with a sign saying, "No way, we'll vote you out." And in some of the communities, we can name a bunch where the mayors and the city councils have been brave. The result has been they got some housing done, and Redwood City would be an example, and then they diselect the mayor. They literally take the mayor and the city council out of office. It happens. It's happened in Mountain View. It's happened in Redwood City. So as an elected official, who gets to either approve or disapprove housing, you have to be really thoughtful about, your decision, politically.
But devil's advocate, don't those folks, they pay taxes in that neighborhood, don't they have a right to have a say? And
Yeah,
those
They should have
council
a-
members are representing
They
them.
should have a say, but every one of them is someone who's housed in that community. So their house was built at a time when someone could have said, that house shouldn't be built. And so I think we're coming around, as we poll on this, in the Bay Area, most people, a strong majority of people believe housing should be built, and a nice majority believe it should be built in my community. And that's a change from the past. However, it's still fairly easy to find a group that's really passionate, willing to come out and stay.
I haven't seen that study, but that's fascinating.
And I think that gets to the question of policy because, if there is local opposition to housing, the question is what process do the policymakers then take in that feedback, and then can we just make a decision at some point and then move along? Because what we see in San Francisco, and I think throughout the Bay Area, is we see not just opposition at one hearing and then everyone makes a collective decision to move on, but we see iterative examples of opposition coming up time and time again over the course of a project, and it can take a process that should maybe take 6 months or a year and make it 2, 3, 5 years, and it may happen in the end or it may not, but it's become much more expensive. It's taken a tremendous amount of time and energy. So I think it's really about coming up with policies that provide an avenue for people to provide the feedback that is absolutely their right, but then let's make a collective decision. Let's let the policymakers make a decision, or in some cases the people, and then let's move on. And Mayor Breed in her year in office, and I have many colleagues who have worked on these policy issues, has proposed a charter amendment, which is essentially San Francisco's constitution, to change the process in San Francisco to make teacher housing and affordable housing up to 140% of area median income as of right, which basically means if it meets the zoning laws, which is a law that everyone has that everyone has had a chance to weigh in on and that's been passed. If it meets those criteria and those standards, then it's just a question of what the design is and its objective criteria. But it wouldn't have given people a chance to stop that if it was already something that was in those parameters. And unfortunately, that charter amendment has not moved forward right now, but I know it's something that Mayor Breed wants to continue to look at. And there is an initiative ordinance on the ballot this year that we came to agreement with the supervisors on to rezone certain public lands and streamline the process for some teacher and affordable housing. We do see that as a step in the right direction.
The mayor just had a huge heck of a battle with the Navigation Center on the Embarcadero.
Absolutely.
And it did go through, but that was a big fight.
It's under construction now. I mean, this is a question of, we all say that there's a crisis. There are some solutions that we identify. In this case, the crisis is homelessness, and housing and homelessness are fundamentally related. And we talk about them as if they're different crises sometimes, but let's be clear, they are part of one crisis. And we have in San Francisco pioneered the use of navigation centers, which are really enhanced shelters with an additional suite of services. And we see an opportunity to put a navigation center on public property along the Embarcadero, and we do get a lot of support, but also a lot of opposition. And Mayor Breed was steadfast. The local supervisor was steadfast in pushing that forward. And there are lawsuits and whatnot, but the city is proceeding what we call at risk while those lawsuits go on, and it's under construction.
So you're out there on a limb.
Yeah, we're out there. I mean, we feel very confident about having done everything the right way, but that's not something that, so for example, affordable or market rate housing developers are going to do, because if they lost the lawsuit at the end, they have to rip it out. I mean,
Right.
this is a temporary condition for us in any case. But
Okay.
Mayor Breed really fought hard to make that happen.
Elizabeth Kneebone, Research Director, UC Berkeley Turner Center for Housing Innovation. Elizabeth, let me tap you on something that Justin just said. I think we know intellectually that this is not the case, but I think there is sort of a disconnect that homelessness and housing are often one and the same. I think sometimes we think that homeless population is a different group than we're talking about housing. What kind of information have you been able to put together, or level of understanding have you found with hard information about the connection between the housing crisis and the homeless crisis?
Well, I think especially as we've seen the numbers really ratcheting up so quickly across the Bay Area with the number of homeless, what you're seeing is in these increased numbers, there are a lot more families that are homeless. There are a lot more economically homeless, which means they don't have enough money to afford the housing. It's a housing challenge because there's not enough affordable housing. So they're living in their car, or they're living in an RV, or in, and some of these counts don't always even capture this sort of unstably housed people who are sleeping on couches or in friends and relations.
Crashing wherever they
That's
can,
right. So
basically.
that is a really unstable housing situation. They are homeless, but they have shelter. And so those counts in some ways are understating people who have become so economically precarious that they really are essentially homeless. So I think that's absolutely right, that they're inextricably linked. And I think a lot of the housing first sorts of models have shown that a stabilized housing situation, even for homeless individuals who are experiencing additional challenges like substance abuse or mental illness, like being able to get people into a stable housing situation is critical. And that requires having more housing stock that you can use for that purpose, whether it's supportive housing or other kinds of subsidized housing to be able to house that population. But I also want to come back just briefly to that question that you asked, because I think it's a really critical one in solving this region's challenge about isn't it a homeowner's right to say, I don't want new housing, like this is my community? And I feel like that is a fair question, and yet, as we look at the level of the crisis that we have, when an entrant who is able to get into a community and buy into a community then says, we want to freeze production that would allow others to come into this community, that makes that community more exclusive.
But to be fair, Elizabeth, just to play devil's advocate, sometimes it's a different. If the community is protesting the development of a different housing, maybe they don't want low-income housing that will affect their property values in their neighborhood. They bought at a certain price, and they don't want other people building
right. So they're exclusive.
Housing.
So they're being exclusionary with those sorts of
But
policy
don't they have
concerns.
the right to be exclusionary?
Well,
if they have
so this is what I wanted to say about that, because you would think, yes, they have the right to do that, but what then you start layering on top of that is so they're not going to have that housing there. So prices go up, values go up, it becomes harder to afford. Where does the low-income housing get built? Not in areas of opportunity, right? In lower income places where land might be more available, or the policy landscape is less difficult. And what we've seen over decades with these sorts of exclusionary jurisdictional practices, all in the name of, but this is my community that I'm protecting, ends up creating really disparate segregation patterns, right, by race and by income, that create all kinds of other costs and consequences that then the taxpayers are grappling with, even in that exclusionary community.
But do you think then the public officials and the developers should be able to build whatever they want, wherever they want?
I feel like what Judson was describing, that's not, and this is where I was talking about the nuance at the very beginning, why it becomes so much a black and white, well, you're going to Manhattanize my suburb, and that is almost never what people are talking about when they say that you should be able to build a duplex or a fourplex, or this single family neighborhood might be able to sustain some more modest density that would actually increase the number of housing units without changing the character or the visual sort of aesthetic of the neighborhood. But you could house more families, and you could house more people because there are more units at a more affordable level. And you could integrate affordable subsidized housing into these higher opportunity neighborhoods, which actually has really good outcomes for the kids and families who live in those neighborhoods, and no negative outcomes for the higher income families who live in those neighborhoods. So that's all just to say that.
Can you say that truthfully, that there's no negative outcome?
I have an
Yes.
example.
Yeah,
There's
please.
good evidence
Share.
to support that
good.
too. But yeah.
I live in Oakland.
This was great, by the way, really
And,
interesting.
I live in a condo, and I live next door to a bridge housing development, and I've been there about 5 years, and I can tell you my property values are continuing to go up. Personally, that's not my issue. I'd like to see stabilization for the greater good, but
But you haven't been hurt economically.
not at all, and it's a wonderful little community of 3 developments, and new ones are being built as we speak adjacent to it. And so I think, you know, that's just one example, but I do believe that one of the things as housers and, you know, that we need to do and perhaps get better at is sharing, you know, factual information, because there is some out there, and we do have great
If I
organizations.
could,
Yeah.
thank you for that, Marianne. I think it's really important. We've always taken the attitude that the housing that we develop has to blend in with the neighborhood. It has to be the nicest, most well-kept place in the neighborhood. And we have done some modest studies that have shown that the surrounding property areas have gone up in value with appreciation, and it has not taken the neighborhood down. I do think that it is a fair question for people to be able to say, what are my rights as a homeowner? But they also have to be, as Elizabeth has said, not exclusionary. One of the nice things that's happened, and I've been in this business for a number of years, I've stood up in front of many planning commissions, many city councils, and had people riled up because they thought it was going to bring their property values down. But the tide is really starting to turn because of the crisis. And so we now have YIMBYs, not just NIMBYs. And the YIMBYs are the ones who come to the city council meetings and say, we need this. And they're doing it in San Francisco, they're doing it in Oakland, they're doing it in many cities across the country. And so
And
I
is
think
that
there's a
what,
recognition
is that
of that.
Cynthia? Is that altruistic on their part, or is there are they seeing some kind of benefit from it?
Well, I
They
think
just-
a lot of them, though, I've met a number of them. I've you know, talked to them in council meetings and said, thank you for showing up. And it is a form of altruism, but they're also knowing that a number of their colleagues, their daughters, their brothers can't afford to live here. And so they're saying, we got to do something about it. And they actually are being funded and raising money as nonprofits to go out and simply advocate for more housing.
They're often young people who
Yes.
like to have a future in the Bay Area, and I
That's
think
right.
you know, they should have some opportunity, you know, this, like their parents had, to live in many cases in the place they grew up, and they're being excluded. And so, you know, they're passionate about this, and we want to be really supportive of having groups like that that can, you know, take the time to show up and say, you know, this may not be my house, but it's people like me, you know, and we are the future of the community. And I think in the Bay Area we have to think about the hollowing out of our young folks, the talented people, really the future. You know, we should be doing everything we can to try to accommodate the next generation being able to fit in. It's so unfair to think that people who, you know, start a life here, and they say it all, you hear it all the time, I'm not going to be able to stay in the Bay Area. You know, I'm thinking about other communities because it's affordable. And we're the ones, in effect, making it unaffordable, at least in...
Well, we all have probably a similar experience. I mean, I remember that the first apartment I had when I started working, I think, was $315 a month, which was a lot of money then, but not
Right.
really, and it was affordable. I've got 2 adult sons. The youngest is 26. He just recently moved to an apartment. And they're all, you know, as the young people do, several people living in one apartment. I think they all pay $1,400 a piece or something.
Yeah.
That's pretty pricey if you're 26 years old.
And then when they want their own apartment, when they get a little older, it's impossible to do it, and they start having to look elsewhere.
Yeah, he couldn't do it.
And that's
We're-
what's happening.
We're seeing it at the regional level too. I mean, it is a turn that used to be people would just show up and say why anything regional related to housing was bad, and kind of an anti-development posture that was fairly uniform. Now we're seeing a lot more people show up and say, no, we need to have better housing policy. We need to have development in the right places. We need to have a range of development. They tend to be younger folks. And I think it gets back to one of the issues we were touching on earlier in terms of there's a lot of talk, particularly in the media, about a Bay Area exodus. And there is an exodus of people, oftentimes not by choice, who've lived here for a long time. Either they're not going to be able to afford the lifestyle they would like, or they
And
just
retire
literally,
after it, right?
or they literally just can't afford to be here. And they're either doing long commutes or they're moving out of the state or the region
A lot of
altogether.
people just cash out of their homes to leave. I mean,
But I think fundamentally what's really going on is not an exodus, it's a churn, because the region's population is still going up. Not as much as it was a few years ago, but it's still rising, and it becomes, to your point, Dan, of don't people have a right? They absolutely have a right. But I think it comes down to what region do people want the Bay Area to be? Do they want it to be a place where everybody gets a chance to be here, where it's a diverse region, where there's a diversity of incomes and so forth, or is it a place where the wealthiest get to be here? And that's a shift that I think a lot of people are experiencing throughout the Bay Area, and it creates a lot of tension, and it creates a lot of challenges.
Well, it's emotional for a lot of people.
It's emotional. It's very personal for a lot of people.
What do you think is causing that shift? Just the number of homeless that people now see, or just the costs and the people that they know that are having a hard time making ends meet? What do you think?
I think a lot of it, to Jim's point, is we see a lot of young people who, they may have grown up on, say, the peninsula, and most of their friends are gone.
Right.
They've moved to Denver or Austin or Boise, wherever, where they could actually make ends meet because they couldn't see a way forward in the Bay Area, and they don't want that to be the reality for people.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to bring up quickly that, on this question that you raised about, the rights of a community to determine its destiny and its character. And, there's no question, we don't, I think, want to ruin or, dramatically change the character of a city. That's not the object of this. But we do have, and this is an important part of housing policy, we've invested a lot in this region in transportation infrastructure, in BART, in Caltrain, in VTA, in Muni, in other systems. And as you track through those systems, you find a lot of land around the stations, particularly in which there's a dearth of housing and sometimes commercial development as well. And so when we built those systems, and Bay Area Council was the group that actually built BART back in way back in the 60s, we didn't think ahead to this question, that we should have controlled the land around the stations and determined right from the beginning that those were places that should have higher density, that could handle heights, that could handle people coming going. They could be places where people could live without a car or use a car infrequently. And so we're going back on this, and we passed one law last year in Sacramento that gives BART the right to more control the destiny of its own land. And I think one of the biggest pushes in policy is toward transit-oriented development. And where you don't want to necessarily push density everywhere, these places, and there's a lot of them, provide a lot of opportunity for a lot of housing. And
these places meaning where they're transportation hubs.
Yeah, and some cities are welcoming it and really working on this, and you can see it happening. And some places are still, highly resistant, and there's lawsuits around and those kinds of things. And so I think as a region, we really need to come together around this and say, we really missed the boat when the region was built.
But who knew, right?
To achieve density in the places where we really could handle it, and where we actually invested, the equivalent of billions of dollars in our regional transportation infrastructure. And that's really the secret to keeping a lot of cars off the road and having a better quality of life, for a lot of people, for all of us, really.
And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so key to get the housing built in San Francisco and the Bay Area as well. But certainly in San Francisco, we do have a dense transit system. We have a growing bicycling, protected bike lane network. We know we have more we need to do on transportation in San Francisco. I know in the years I've lived in San Francisco for over 20 years, and congestion has certainly increased. Whether it's on Muni or even biking. I mean, I bike around the city a lot, and it's great to have all the bicyclists, but we need to make sure we have the infrastructure to both make biking safe and make sure there's enough room. But we do have the opportunity to build here in the city, and we see more high rises in places like Central Soma that are coming. There's a residential building going up on the corner of Mission and South Van Ness that a lot of people are commenting on.
And are these affordable?
And so they either have affordable housing on site, usually around 20%, or they're paying a fee to help get more affordable housing built. So that is part of the bargain as well with market rate development, that it helps fund affordable housing, and that's another reason why it is important. That should not be the only source or even the main source for affordable funding for affordable housing, but it's a big part of it. So, and we are environmentalists in the Bay Area. We care deeply about the future of the planet, about climate change. But if we don't figure out how to build more transit-oriented development and stop the super commutes from the Central Valley into the Bay Area core, I mean, we are half of our greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation, and our land use patterns and the housing policies we've pursued for decades are the big driver of those transportation emissions. So it's all related. Again, housing and homelessness are intimately related, but our environmental future is also tied to figuring out a better way to build a better Bay Area.
Okay, excellent. Anyone else want to jump in? Well, this is from Leslie. Why can't we convert many vacant buildings into affordable housing. There are not as many vacant buildings as there used to be because the economy's booming, but anyone want to tackle Leslie's question? Is there any opportunity there that's being missed?
Well, I'll start with one comment, and then I'm sure Cynthia has lots to say. But in Oakland, when we passed with a very high margin the Measure KK bond, its focus was intentionally on acquiring existing market rate apartments and converting them to affordable. So we have intentionally invested quite a bit into that strategy. And we've been able to turn probably, half a dozen buildings around in that way, just with that one source. And we know developers are doing that with other sources. And then we plan on releasing a notice of funding availability in the next week or two, frankly, to invest in some more of that kind of activity. Our Mayor Libby Schaaf, is very focused on that as a preservation and as an anti-displacement strategy, and I think we're seeing some success.
Okay. Anyone else on that?
Well, I was just going to say that it is true that there aren't as many vacant buildings as there used to be, although there certainly are some that didn't originally start out as housing. That could be used for housing conversion, and I think that is a very good idea to explore. I'm really glad that San Francisco and Oakland both have focused some efforts, lots of efforts actually, on preservation. We've been engaged in a lot of preservation. It's expensive to retrofit buildings though because of the code changes, and you don't save as much money as you think, but if it is a vacant space, then it's a space that needs to be occupied for housing.
Right, but as you say, if it's a 40-year-old warehouse or building, the codes have changed. It's pretty expensive. It's almost cheaper to tear it down and start over.
Not always.
I mean, it's a extreme version of the vacant buildings, but one of the projects that I've been working on lately is the rehabilitation of Pier 70 here in San Francisco along our southern waterfront, just south of the Giants ballpark and south of Mission Rock. And there are historic buildings there that are part of the property of the Port of San Francisco, which is part of our city government. And there's a project there to build thousands of units of housing, rehabilitating some existing buildings and building some new ones. And I think it's the kind of creative reuse of what we think of as not having any land in San Francisco, but we do in some places, but we have to be creative on how to use it. So
That area
that's an
has just
example.
been
That's an
exploding.
example of that. Yeah.
The real estate market's also changed quite a bit, and so a few years ago, there was a lot of vacant industrial space, warehouse space in the Bay Area, and there was a lot of desire to convert it to housing, but there was a lot of resistance in a lot of communities and even at a regional policy level because we were little by little losing industrial capacity and the jobs, the blue-collar jobs that go along with that. That battle took place in San Francisco. It took place in Oakland. It was a very common issue. Then what happened is we changed the way we consume and the way products are delivered. And warehouses in the last few years, that's the hottest item on the real estate market. And so warehouses have tripled in value. You can't get them, and warehouses are used as warehouses, and they're used by the folks Amazon and related to that to be able to get goods to us. And so what was available at one time
Is the market has
not
changed.
available anymore.
Is
you got a
the-
warehouse, keep it.
Yeah. Will things tip? Is part of this because the economy is just thriving? In the downturn in 2008, did we see a change in housing costs when there weren't as many jobs around? Is part of the problem here? I mean, it's a good problem to have that the economy is thriving, obviously. But if that were to suddenly change, will the housing situation change?
Yeah, I think that what we need to remember is that we did have the Great Recession, and the Great Recession saw an exodus of people from the construction trades. They moved into other jobs, and we didn't
There's just no building, right?
There was no building going on. We had a lot of vacancies in housing, let's face it.
Did
the
apartment
foreclosure.
costs and did rent go down during that time?
It did. It did.
Just a
Rent
little.
went
Just a
down.
little.
Well, it depended on the market.
Yeah,
San Francisco,
depended
just
on
a
the-
little.
Yeah.
Other places, quite a bit.
Part of the region.
But I do think that what happened was we just did not build back up the trades, particularly the skilled trades. So what we're seeing is a huge shortage of labor. So we go out looking for bids. Many of the general contractors are pulling upon the same labor pool, And frankly, you know, a lot of them moved out of the Bay because it was cheaper.
Right.
And so they don't have a place to live in order to build. So it's a very cyclical process. We need to build up our trades, and I think that in many instances we're working very hard to do that. In San Francisco and other communities, there's there's a program, Manpower program that provides educational training for new workforce development. And so getting people who might be low income into those trades is one potential silver lining. We've created at Potrero a number of jobs, and we're creating a number of jobs on a number of housing sites by pulling in those people and teaming them up with the trades so they learn a craft. And so I think that will be one thing, but we need to do it across all sectors.
Well, one point I think it's important to make here is that there's an implication sometimes in this challenge with the jobs housing balance, and it's a huge challenge. We've grown tens of thousands of jobs and thousands of housing units. It's a supply and demand challenge that is tremendous. But the answer to the housing crisis is not to undermine our own economy. I mean, when at the height of the Great Recession, even in San Francisco, we had almost double-digit unemployment. We're down around 2 now. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that people have jobs. We do need to make sure those jobs are well-paying. We need to make sure they, that they again have a job ladder to continue to rise through our economic ranks. But I do think sometimes there's almost an implication that, well, maybe the economy could just not be as good as it is, and we do need to make sure the economy benefits people more broadly. But the answer to our housing crisis is to get more housing built and to get more affordable housing built, and we should be thankful as a Bay Area. And I do think we almost take it for granted now, and there will be a time in the future at some point where we don't see the economy going as strongly as it is now, and then we'll be talking about how to jumpstart it.
Yeah, well, the old adage, a rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at least with a thriving economy, it gives us some financial resources to deal with some of the problems. This question is from Mary Rose. Are developers still, as she phrases it, still getting away with not building below market housing in new developments? That seems to be a big trend now. I think a lot of developers are required. Around the Bay Area?
Inclusionary zoning is pretty much the standard in the Bay Area.
Inclusionary zoning is the term.
So pretty much almost anywhere.
So if I come to you and say I want to build a new subdivision,
you're
most
going
of the
to have
time
to provide for affordable housing.
and what does that mean, Jim? How much? Is there a standard?
It varies, but it's 20% is it's risen toward the 20% level. We've had developments in the area at 35 and 40%, and it's sometimes a negotiation between in San Francisco. It's always a negotiation between the developer and the city, and
Her question may be,
essentially the developer has to absorb the gap between how much it costs to build a unit and how much they can market it for, and that price comes out in the other units. So when you think about how high the cost is, it's because the remaining 80% have to absorb the cost of subsidizing
the 20%. Interesting.
And my
but
view
that
of
only makes the
is
80% more expensive.
It certainly does,
Right.
and so the notion that when you have a limited amount of development, even if you have a lot of development, it's still limited relative to the overall population of the community, and that we look to the developer and sort of say, "Gotcha, you want to build this, you have to do it." What I think, and maybe the Seattle example is a good idea, and we're looking at this in the Bay Area. There's a process called CASA, which we'll probably talk about, which is how do we, the federal government's not coming to our rescue anytime soon. It used to be different. We as a region really are going, with some help maybe from the state now, really look to providing these kinds of subsidies at a scale which will have an impact on a problem that is confronting us in such a big way. We now have 35,000, conservatively 35,000 homeless people on the streets in the Bay Area,
Right.
based on the new point in time counts. And we just did a study with McKinsey on homelessness from a regional perspective. Most of the people who are homeless are just kind of victims of this housing market.
They just can't afford.
80% of them have lived here for years. They used to have a house here. Something happened. They got evicted. They had a medical issue, a crisis. They lost a job, whatever it was.
And it was too much.
And it used to be options. You could lose a job, but you didn't lose your house because the house was only $350 a month. You could hang in there for a while. It's not like that anymore.
Okay.
So all roads seem to lead to homelessness, and so we have this huge homelessness pipeline, and so we have to, even if it feels odd to us, because historically we as a society did not feel we as taxpayers had to fund housing. We fund the police, no question. Maintenance of the parks, the libraries, the fire department, we pay our taxes for that. Housing? You kidding? I don't.
It's not my problem.
I don't pay for my house. So that
Elizabeth, you
has
want
to change.
All right, Elizabeth?
Yeah, her question may have also been trying to get at how they accommodate affordable housing, because the ordinances vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So what the requirement is different from place to place, and whether it has to be on site, that does vary from place to place. Or it might be some places allow you to pay into a fund or an in lieu fee so that it can accommodate housing elsewhere. So those nuances, those vary from place to place, but by and large, many places are accommodating in some way for below market rate units and new development.
Okay.
I think also some of the suburban communities where it's an in lieu fee that's the common practice for market rate development, there may not be enough of it amassed to actually lead to building, and that's an issue for the region, that there are pots of money sitting in suburban communities around the region where fees have been collected related to development for affordable housing and it's not being utilized. And when we have so many people on the street who are unsheltered, that's an example of something that should probably change, to utilize those funds and get housing built more quickly for people who are vulnerable to homelessness.
Okay. I'm going to pause here for a moment. How much time do we have? We have 1 minute. My timing is good. All right. We're going to pause. We're going to go back on ABC 7 News. The News at 5 is on the air at the moment. I'm not there because I'm here, and so we'll go on TV in just a minute, but I'm going to pause. But I would love to encourage all of you. Thank you for tuning in on our Facebook page, our website, and on our YouTube channel. Please let me hear from you. We have absolutely terrific experts who are eager to answer your questions. We're trying to go in as much in depth as we possibly can in this housing town hall about all of the issues surrounding the housing crisis that we're in. And it is a very nuanced and very complex issue. So please send us your questions. Facebook page works really well for that. I'm going to pause here in a moment so that I can go back on TV, and I just want to make sure I stop in time to hear Amma and Kristen send it over my way. So online, thanks for bearing with us. Back here in just a moment. But now you can watch dead silence behind the scenes. Hang on. Hey, listen, Amma, Kristen, we are having a really terrific conversation here online. We're on our ABC 7 News webpage, our Facebook page, and also our YouTube channel with a panel of 6 terrific experts from around the Bay Area who really are deeply involved and deeply informed on the housing crisis and why it has become such a problem. It's really a nuanced and complicated issue, much more complex than sometimes people realize. We always say we need to build more housing. That's more complicated than it may appear. I want to touch base with one of our panelists, Marianne Leshin, the Deputy Director of Housing and Community Development in Oakland. Marianne, thank you and all of you guys for being with us. Let me ask you, you've seen so much change in Oakland in the last 2 or 3 years, which is exciting. The economy is doing very well. People are moving in, restaurants are going up, businesses are thriving, but it has created a significant housing challenge in Oakland as it has everywhere else in the Bay Area. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing in Oakland and what you're hoping can be done about it.
Sure, thanks.
We have about 40 seconds.
Well, I'd like to throw into the conversation another sort of vantage point, which is the anti-displacement vantage point. I know the compact addresses this as well, but we have stepped in and invested quite a bit of funds. We've also been able to enlist, this was through the mayor, philanthropy to create these anti-displacement programs that assist individuals who are residents of Oakland in staying in their homes to the extent that there may be an eviction, that if they had legal representation, they might be able to stave off, or if there was some blip in their ability to pay rent on a given month, there's emergency financial assistance that can be provided.
So a big focus now in Oakland is to preventatively keep people from...
To keep people here. And I thought about this program when the comments were being discussed.
I'm going to have to wrap in a minute, but
Okay,
finish your point.
around change and you know, what rights do people have to keep a community the way that it is. That's sort of the flip side, because for many of us who've lived in Oakland for a long time, we're seeing that change happen because of market forces, and
Right.
we want to.
Okay. And one of the things we've been talking about here is that not in my neighborhood issue where people who may realize there's a housing crisis, but they don't want to be part of solving it in their neighborhood necessarily. And the tide is beginning to turn on a lot of that. Marianne will have a lot more time online to continue our conversation and to finish those thoughts. But Kristen, Amma, I'd encourage people who are watching to go to our Facebook page and send in your questions, because this panel of experts is anxious to answer as many of them as we can possibly get to. We're having a really lively and interesting discussion that's quite in-depth on a very complicated and very important issue, the housing crisis that we talked a lot about in our effort to build a better Bay Area on ABC7, but it's on everyone's mind, and so we are really focusing on it. We'll come back in a little while, but for now, we'll send it back to you. We'll continue here online. You bet. Okay, you bet. Thank you. Okay, and we'll continue. So, so Marianne, because people are also watching, please finish your point, and then we'll go back.
Sure, yeah, so I think that, you know, the changes that are happening are ones that many in the community feel is almost like a, you know, grieving process to see the community, the demographics change, race, ethnic-wise, and economic-wise. So yeah, I think the ability to be creative with anti-displacement activities has been something we've been focused on. So to the extent we can, number one, enable people to stay in their homes, and this is not just for renters, it's also for homeowners, and the county of Alameda actually has a complementary program as well, is really a key component of what we're focused on. And then secondly, to the extent that retaining that home is not possible, then ensuring a soft landing someplace else to
Help
prevent
them
homelessness.
transition. Okay. Elizabeth, what information, what research have you seen about these changing neighborhoods around the Bay Area, the changing demographics, ethnically, religiously, I suppose, but also socioeconomically? Are you seeing real changes as a result of the job growth pushing longtime residents out? Is that really happening to the extent we hear it is?
I mean, we see quite a bit of change, both within the Bay Area and beyond, because to what Ken was talking about before about who's moving in and out as this crisis has reached further up the income distribution. When you see that, if you look at the income distribution of who's moving out, most of those people make less than $100,000 a year. 40% of outmovers between 2010 and 2016 made less than $50,000 a year. Another quarter were between 50 and 100,000. And those people weren't likely to move to Denver or to Seattle or to New York. Higher income folks who left went to those places.
What did these folks do?
They went to the Central Valley, or they went
I
just
see.
beyond the Bay Area to where it's more affordable. And I think that's telling that the more income constrained folks were, when they actually, first of all, within the metro area, you can see that poverty has tilted more towards the suburbs. In 2000, just over half of the poor population lived outside the core cities of San Francisco and Oakland.
Really?
And
That's
Hayward.
that's a big change, isn't it?
And well, it was just over 50%, and now it's over 60%.
Okay.
So you've really seen this tipping towards the suburbs as we've seen these price pressures increasing in the core cities. And then just looking beyond the region, that's the next step, right? Is when people can't even get to Antioch or Pittsburgh, they're now moving to the Central Valley.
You know what's interesting is as we were talking, Elizabeth, I was thinking when you mentioned the percentage of people who make less than $100,000. You know, $100,000 is a reasonable amount of money in most places around the country, but here, it's gotten so expensive. I mean, if you're a teacher making $40,000, that is really tough.
And the
to get by
outmovers,
on.
yeah, the outmovers that we see, especially under $50,000, are disproportionately Black, they're disproportionately Latino. So to that point of what kind of region are we becoming, the more that, because the in-movers' incomes are skewing higher, right? So the people moving out are skewing lower, the people moving in are skewing higher. So it is changing.
Because they're coming for these very expensive
That's right,
jobs.
and with higher, you know, to fill these high-skilled jobs and well-paying jobs.
Where does that end? We can't, you know, not everybody can make $250,000 a year and have it be affordable. I mean, where does it end? I mean, is it just because the economy is thriving?
The median income in the Bay Area for a family is about $100,000, and in the Bay Area,
And it's not enough for a lot of people.
22% of the people who have that income, 22% can afford a home. 22% in the country.
Jim,
50
repeat that, just because that's
so
a
the
shock.
median income in the Bay Area is about
$100,000.
$100,000, and in the Bay Area, 22% of families who earn the median income, 22% can afford a home. In the rest of the nation, about 54% of folks who earn the median income, which is lower.
It's not
than the
even
rest of the
100.
nation,
Right.
can afford a home. So that's what, that's the difference that we're experiencing here, and the level of the crisis that we're experiencing.
Where is this heading? I mean,
Well, I think Elizabeth talked about folks moving out into the Central Valley. We now have, on a daily basis, about 200,000 people a day commuting into the Bay Area for their job. 200,000 folks a day.
That's a real number?
Are
200,000?
super commuters. They spend about an hour and a half or more, typically driving, because we don't have the rail infrastructure to support these commutes, and anyone who lives, experiences 580 or Highway 4. Those roads are jam-packed at 5 in the morning so people can get to their job. So we're really impinging upon people's lifestyles. I had a meeting a few days ago with Mayor Michael Tubbs in Stockton, and in Stockton, they're seeing a huge number of people from the Bay Area moving into Stockton, putting pressure on the housing market in Stockton. So, it has
Are housing and rental costs going up in Stockton?
They
too?
are.
Absolutely.
There's a ripple effect. So, we would think those prices are cheap from the Bay Area, but by, Central Valley, Fresno, I mean, places in the Central Valley are experiencing pressure on housing. And, we really need to do something about this, and do it maybe even, thoughtfully as a super region, and plan transportation, housing together, because we're all experiencing this. There's more people who need something here than can afford to get it.
I want to focus really quickly on the regional approach, because you're focused, Judson, on San Francisco. Mary Ann, you're mostly focused on Oakland, which is terrific, but it's a bigger problem than that. And of course, regional approaches become even more complicated because everybody has their own vested interest. You talk about not in my backyard. When you talk about San Francisco wanting to do something that may impact Oakland, well, maybe Oakland doesn't want to cooperate with that, or vice versa. And it becomes much more complicated when you talk about a regional approach. But without a regional approach, and that region, as you said, is now a super region. I mean, it's not really just the 9-county Bay Area. It's beyond that.
Yeah, by law, it's still the Bay Area, but in reality, it's grown, and you really can't ignore it. And so, we do this for a living.
Yeah.
This is all we do. Is think
We
about
do.
it.
That's where the gray hair comes from. We say regional, but a lot of times regional is state policy. For example, thinking about Oakland, a city I know and love, between 2010 and 2015, there was almost nothing being built in Oakland, but there was enormous displacement happening because the rent prices and for sale prices of houses were going through the roof, and a lot of people were moving out because they couldn't afford to stay
And a lot
there.
of them, that was the time when people were really moving in too, right?
People were moving in and people were moving out because they were seeing their rents go through the roof. Some of those people ended up on the streets, and that's part of the homelessness
People are
crisis.
being displaced from San Francisco to Oakland, and then
And
to
they
They
Oakland,
move,
yeah.
they move
So-
further east, and it's all part of a picture. But just using the Oakland example, I think there's a way that market rate development can be set up as the problem and the scapegoat in that dynamic. But between 2010 and 2015, there wasn't any. The problem in part was there wasn't any. There wasn't any place for people who wanted housing and could afford it to move. So that bid up the prices of the more affordable housing that wasn't protected. Those people, if they were fortunate enough, had to find a cheaper place nearby. Many had to move far away, and some, tragically, ended up on the street. That isn't necessarily solved by regional government, but certainly state policy plays a role. We used to have redevelopment in California. It was the biggest source of affordable housing funding. It went away right about the time, arguably, we needed it the most, which is when the Bay Area economy started to take off after the Great Recession. Without that source of funding, without that subsidy, lots of people are at risk, but extremely low income people, the folks who make, say, 20% of the median income or lower, they are at serious risk of homelessness. And I think to Jim's earlier point,
So you're talking about people making $25,000 a
yeah,
year.
they might be nurses' aides or teachers' aides. They,
Okay.
many of them are working. They don't make a lot of money, And if we don't want those people to end up homeless, we have to find a way to support housing for that population, because they are at extreme risk of homelessness, and it's a big challenge for the region. We can't pretend it's going to go away. It will get worse over time if we don't shift course.
I think that's an important point to make too, that we talk about job growth and we often focus on the high-end job growth, the tech sector, the big paying jobs, but there are a lot of low wage and moderate wage jobs being created too. I mean, in San Francisco, I think it's something like 40% or almost 40% of jobs pay less than $40,000 a year. So those jobs are growing as well. Teachers' aides, home health aides, especially with an aging
And to
population.
Cynthia's point, to construction jobs and trade jobs as well.
That's right. And so those are exactly the kinds of jobs that may be growing quickly, but the housing options are the most limited, and so we see this increased risk of homelessness or displacement.
If we look into the crystal ball, it seems to me that we are really beginning to address this in a much more significant, focused way in the last year or two. If we don't do anything and do something drastic, which is what we've been talking about here, what's the future look? What's the Bay Area like in 10 years? We'll have 400,000 people coming in from the Central Valley commuting, and we'll have, 50, 60, 75,000 homeless instead of 35, which is already bad. What will the future look like?
You'll see a hollowing out of the economy because we just can't sustain the region. The quality of life is one of the major attraction points, is why people come to the Bay Area in the first place. Why we've been able to attract, this sort of people who can fit in the knowledge economy. They want to live here, and the Bay Area is a wonderful place, and we shouldn't set that aside for a moment. It's a reason, we got here, and
right.
Part of it is that people love it. It's an open-minded place. It's a diverse place. It's physically, the geography is amazing. We have great weather. I mean, it's all these attractions. But at some point, if people can't afford to live here, and there's just more and more displacement, there's more and more angst. If more and more people think we're on the wrong track, which is as opposed to the right track as a place, sooner or later, then the companies, will make decisions based on that. Everything.
Other parts of the
generates
country look more
choices, and
attractive.
sooner or later, you lose, the edge. And there's so many places in the country and the world that would do anything, and they come all the time to try to do it. Haven't been too successful to try to attract that economy away, because that's the economy that really, creates broad levels of jobs, not just high-tech jobs. It creates an overall economy. And we've been fortunate to have it, and as I think Judson said, we somewhat take this for granted. So it's hard to achieve stasis in an economy.
Sure.
You're kind of going up or you're kind of going down.
Yeah, it
and we've
doesn't stay
seen
the
this
same.
before. And we can think of regions. In 1970, Detroit was the innovation capital of the world. No question about it. People were heading there. That's where it was all happening. Within a few years, Detroit was, a
Declining
really
city. They've
difficult
bounced back
place.
significantly, but
And it's taken years to make begin making a comeback. So we don't want that. We really do need to. Resolve this.
A guy that I've gotten to know who is a tech giant. I visited his home a couple of months ago and kind of consult with him a little bit in terms of using him to help educate me. He made an interesting point, and he was a tech titan, that the Bay Area, the Silicon Valley, isn't what they think it still is in terms of what's happening in other parts of the country. I think that from his perspective, Silicon Valley thinks it's still top dog, and it in some respects isn't anymore. There's some other parts of the country that are doing some pretty amazing things, and they don't have the housing crunch that we do as a result.
There are alternatives. I think if you take a look at the Bay Area economy, it's actually, I would take issue. I think the statistics would show we're pretty unique. More than 50% of the unicorn companies in the country we could walk to from this studio right now. It's an amazing fact. We've got Apple, we've got Google, we've got Facebook, Salesforce as headquarters companies. There's no region. The only region that has something like that is Seattle. Not quite as much, but something. But the world is closing in on the Bay Area because they feel they need to be part of that, and that's part of what's pushing this issue. Is the demand to be here is so great, it's putting great pressure on, and we need to somehow or other live up to that that pressure by doing what we should have been doing for the last 40 years or so, which is this steady.
Is that demand changing though? Is that because of our housing crisis, the housing costs, transportation issues, some of the other
Still creating a
overcrowding?
lot of jobs,
I think
despite what
I
everybody
think
says.
it could, but to Jim's point, and he knows it better than I do, we are the global innovation capital to the nth degree, and over this decade, it's just become that much more that way. I do think at some point it's at risk, as was described. I also think that, and this is another hopeful trend, that, you know, I think the business community, this community, the innovation industries are starting to step into this space. Google most recently stepped into it in a significant way. Mark Benioff at Salesforce has really, you know, taken ownership of this issue in particular, the homelessness issue in particular. That, I think, is going to be critical as to whether or not we have a more utopian future or the kind of dystopian future I think everybody around the table fears if we don't shift course. The business community has a major role to play, and it seems that they're more and more willing to play a role, which is really important.
We still need rules that allow people to build, because you could put all the money you want into it, but you have to be able to be enabled to get that permit, to be able to get an approval in a city, to be able to, you know, create housing at the scale. I wanted to mention and get reaction on something. A couple of years ago, we got a bill passed called SB 1069 to make it easier to build accessory dwelling units, granny units or in-law units. And you know, since we got it passed and we're working on additional legislation, we have seen a really big spike in the permitting and the construction of those units, which produce affordable housing. You know, when you build one, they're typically affordable. In Los Angeles, it's happening at a much faster pace than in the Bay Area. So,
How big a percentage of the problem is that, however? Does that make a significant impact in the housing crisis?
Well, in Los Angeles, last year, about 30% of all permits taken up were accessory dwelling units. So it can be substantial if 1 out of 5 homes in the Bay Area, you know, were to do this, build an additional unit either attached to or adjacent to or on the property. You know, we could see, we might not solve the problem, no one thing will, but we could see 150,000 units, something like that,
yeah,
built around the region.
we just released an analysis looking at these recent legislative, state and local changes around ADUs. And what it showed is that it makes a difference. And I was just thinking, we haven't really talked about zoning yet, which is such a big piece of this. But you do see, if you get the policies aligned, it really can spur the production. That paper also found it hasn't yet moved the needle on what you might think of affordability or like seniors aging in place, but that's because it's just one piece of the puzzle and it's still early days. But I think the fact that it's a very positive sign that you align the policies, you get the right signals in place, you make it easier to get this sort of production done, and it makes a difference.
We see thousands of this.
Oh, well, I was just going to use a couple of examples, but yes, indeed. And I think that there are some bright policy decisions that have been made that are making a big difference. Some projects we've seen, Potrero Hill, which we talked about earlier, we spent 10 years entitling that project. We're doing the same thing with Balboa Reservoir here in San Francisco, which will house about 700 families. That's in the entitlement process, that's moving along much faster. Senate Bill 35 a couple of years ago allowed for affordable by right zoning, and we just entitled 4840 in the Excelsior District in about 30 days. So yay, that's big progress, and really want to thank Senator Wiener and a number of people at the legislature and the governor for signing that bill. And speaking of Senator Wiener, I just wanted to mention that Senate Bill 50, which was the transit-oriented development, higher density in the transit areas, kind of got stomped on last session. Hopefully there might be a revisit of that when the session picks back up. But that was really to provide for greater density around the transit hubs. And a compromise was made for the smaller communities like Hillsburg. But there was a lot of fear around that all of a sudden we take those transit hubs and we just muscle everybody in the neighborhoods away. So I think there's going to have to be some more considered thought about that, but that might be something promising to get some of those transit areas back into service.
And really utilize them.
That's correct.
His bill died in LA. And so in the Bay Area, I think our legislators are doing a pretty good job of coming up with creative solutions and getting them forward. But his bill, which passed the Housing Committee, which he chaired, was killed by the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Anthony Portantino from Pasadena, who singularly just killed the bill. And so I was at another meeting in Los Angeles last week. It happened to be where Senator Wiener was the speaker. And I think the group was favorable, but what we know is a lot of the legislators in the San Fernando Valley, there isn't a single, the LA City Council has 15 members, and there's not a single city councilman in LA that endorsed the bill. Whereas, in the Bay Area, there was a lot of support for it. Not every.
But not one, literally.
Not a single one. And that he was saying to the group, "Can you help me with your members of the city council? Because if you can't, in California, LA is kind of big. If you can't get legislation through LA, you can't get it passed." And so here we are, the Bay Area, 8.5 million people. The third largest GDP in the country. Would be the 16th largest country in the world if we were a country. But we have to depend upon the state of California, I think Ken was speaking to this, in order to change policy. And some of the things that we think are important in the Bay Area are not seen the same way in other parts of
That may not be having the same
or we
challenge.
can't communicate them well.
It's an interesting juxtaposition with the state of Oregon, which, as I understand it, just passed a suite of bills and being signed by the governor that one looks a lot like SB 50, others look
Yeah.
like some of the elements of the CASA Compact. And they did that in part because they didn't want to be California. I think their Senate leader said they didn't want Portland to be San Francisco. So they're kind of looking at us and saying we don't want our problem to get as bad as it is down there. Their politics are very different because in terms of population, they're a small state of 4 million people, half the size of the Bay Area, a tenth the size of California, a lot less complex. And I think they were able to find political consensus a lot more easily than we have thus far.
But
I mean,
they certainly saw what we've been going through.
Yeah,
and
they
wanted to try
saw
to
the
avoid.
future and they didn't.
Didn't
I
like
mean,
it.
the city that a lot of that's drawing headlines around the country and housing circles is Minneapolis. You were probably. Do you want to?
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
this-
do you
I
want to
was-
jump in and talk about Minneapolis?
I was thinking about the Oregon bill because I feel like maybe one reason it didn't, I don't know, it'd be interesting to ask someone from Oregon. One reason it may not have hit as many obstacles as SB 50 is it didn't pick and choose neighborhoods, right? It said big cities have to allow 4plexes, smaller cities 3plexes, or maybe it's 3plexes and duplexes, and rural areas nothing, right? So they just did it by city size, and it was basically doing away with single-family zoning. And I think the simplicity of that and the fact that you're not targeting so-called winners and losers probably helped build a coalition around it. Minneapolis, same thing. They didn't choose or target parts of the city. They said everywhere in the city we're doing away with single-family zoning and we'll allow triplexes.
In other words, they won't allow a new neighborhood to go in that's nothing but single-family homes.
That's right. If somebody wanted to develop a duplex on something that had been formerly zoned single-family, they
Interesting.
could do that. Now there are other ways that localities regulate the density and what can be built beyond single-family zoning or multifamily. Like they could require a number of units per acre. They can find ways to restrict or pave the way. But I think that first step of getting past the single-family restriction is huge in being able to open up more capacity for buildable land.
What about the federal government? Do we need more help or assistance from the federal government, or will that only make it worse?
Well, I do think that it would be helpful if you go back to, sort of 30 plus years ago and the commitment that the federal government made to the Section 8 program. And I think this is really, this comment is really tied to homelessness to some extent because, and people who have minimum wage jobs and things of that sort, because the, ability to build the kind of housing that Bridge, for example, builds, to put together the capital stack with subsidy component, you still need funds to subsidize the rents because just to operate a building is often a higher cost than the amount of rent you can get from people who have extremely low incomes or on SSI. So that role at the federal level is, I think, huge and under-resourced in a dramatic way. I think San Francisco, did quite an amazing thing with the local operating subsidy program, the LASPA program, where they were actually able to, because of the economy of the city, invest local dollars into rent subsidies, which really drove a lot of development of permanent supportive housing, which essentially is serving people who are homeless with special needs. So I would say yes, if you get in the right direction. It's a pretty simple program. I mean, you're basically subsidizing rents, so people are only paying 30% of their income, and it's not only used in the development of new projects, but people use vouchers, for example, in the marketplace where they can't afford these skyrocketing rents. So that's one role, I think.
We could also use some help from the federal government and the state government in coming up with creative ways to find funding solutions. So, for example, some of the Medicare and then in California Medicaid dollars have, through some flexible programs started under our previous president, were able to be used to help with rapid rehousing, or to recognize that housing and being homeless, being on the street is a health issue, and that we have to understand that there are these huge federal funding streams for health and those kinds of programs, and we should be able to have some flexibility on those, because if somebody's living on the street, they're going to have much worse health outcomes than if we're able to get them housed. And so I think those kind of creative programs are what we need to look at in the future from the federal government, and they just need to get involved in housing again. I mean, we've seen just a tremendous disinvestment really over the last 30 or 40 years.
Why is that, Judson?
I mean, I think to some extent, I think it had a lot of challenges. I think federal funding for housing led to a lot of segregated public housing developments that had a lot of other negative social outcomes. And there's lots of studies that looked at public housing towers, and I think we've moved away from that model to mixed income communities and really making sure that it doesn't work that way. But there might be some. I think that's probably what started it to some extent. But I think also, frankly, just a conservative politics at the federal level, moving away from seeing housing and public programs as crucial.
And housing isn't an entitlement in the federal funding stream, right? It's not like SNAP, like food stamps or Medicaid. It's not like once you qualify, you get it, and that's how it works. Instead, it has to go through a budget process every year, which makes it prime for pruning when they have things like sequestration and other sort of budget priorities that are driving cuts to social programs. But I think it's really also telling right now how many presidential candidates are talking about housing, which is sort of very new. That there's so many who have their housing plans, and a number of those plans do pair things like protections and thinking about subsidies with supply side strategies, with recognizing, I mean, not all of them do, but I think it's important in place where you have both of those paired, because if it's just subsidies, that's not necessarily going to get us out of this. If it's just supply, that's not going to do the near-term protections. And I think we're seeing that being paired more often. Even the Trump administration is trying to think about how to address zoning and things like that at the local level. So I feel like this has risen to national importance that we haven't seen in
I think
decades.
that's right. I also think that we have had a federal housing policy that has really been driven by tax law more recently than by appropriations. So Mary Ann mentioned the Section 8 program, which in some circles has a little bit of a bad name just because of what was happening with the market rate units, as opposed to say having a complete Section 8 based housing development, which is very easy, used to be very easy to finance, because simply you didn't have to go through all this capital stack of amassing 7 different subsidy sources over 3 years.
Right.
What you did was you took that Section 8 subsidy, and then you could get a bank loan against that Section 8 subsidy because there was a contract associated with it, and you could see that there was going to be a continuation of that subsidy. But that's been kind of rolled back. We're still using it. There really isn't any interest in the federal government right now on expanding housing programs. One of the reasons we're doing so much public housing redo is because the disinvestment of public housing has been intact for 30 years.
Is that some sense of at the federal level that this is a local and regional problem, not a federal problem?
Yeah, they got out of the business, and they've been in a wind down mode for a number of years.
And one of the remaining tools in the toolkit was the low-income tax credit. So developers use those, and companies would invest in those because it would give them relief on their taxes. Well, when the federal tax rates were reduced, the value of a tax credit was also reduced, and so they're not buying as much of them, and so that source has been, seeing downward pressure.
Interesting. Is there any, we talked about Portland, we talked about Seattle. Is there any community that you're aware of in the country that is in worse shape than we are?
Well, it's interesting. We've been talking about housing.
And from a housing perspective.
And employment. And, I will say, Bridge is as an affordable developer, is a large enough company. We have about 450 employees. So, I have an army of people who are working on these 10,000 units that we're trying to develop. But recruiting people to the Bay Area right now is really tough. There is a labor shortage of talented young people. I get a lot out of Berkeley, thank you very much, but not enough. And I could train people to become housing developers, which would put more into the supply. But the place where I get the most recruitment, besides locally, is New York City, another high-cost area. People don't want to move here because it's too expensive.
Even from New York? Or less so, but
less so.
It's interesting. Somebody approached me to see if I knew somebody that might be qualified for a job, and it pays pretty well. And the person I reached out to lives in Indiana, not from Indiana, but lives in Indiana, and looked at the job, thought, boy, that's a great job. And the salary is pretty high, not bad. And then said, no, don't even submit.
Yeah,
I looked
we
at the
hear this
house,
all the time.
and the salary is about $200,000, and living in, and this job would be in San Jose area. And he goes, I looked at the cost of a house, and I couldn't buy his two kids. I couldn't buy anything for under 1.5 million or whatever the figure was that I would want. And I owe 180,000 on my house where I live now, and it just made no sense economically.
We find that with our senior level positions, even
senior level
3, 4,
position.
5 years ago. Well, they're generally, I'll say, in that salary range that you just described. And 3, 4, even 5 years ago, say, we would receive a lot of applications from all over the country for a position like that. And in the last few years, for those positions, it's really, the pool is a lot more shallow than it used to be. There just aren't that many people. And sometimes there are people who throw their hat in the ring and they say exactly what your friend said. I did a Trulio, a Zillow search, and you know what, I've got a couple kids and it's just not going to work. We still receive many applications for more junior level positions. People getting out of grad school from all over the country, they want to be here.
They're younger and they're
and I think they see it as an opportunity, and I
do
think
most
there's
of
a
those
certain
have
level
families?
of optimism. They're going to figure it out and make it work.
And get in.
They don't have families.
And so if you're living someplace else and you have a house and you have all you don't have a better lifestyle.
We hear it a lot in the hospitals, UCSF, faculty positions, where there are these incredible jobs, and we really need these people to fill these roles, and we lose them all the time, and we lose them to other medical institutions, research institutions around the country, and they're great jobs, but they need to attract people who are in a very different market, and at the end of the day, people take a look at it and go, just can't make it work.
I mean, we see it with first responders. I mean, firefighters and police officers are paid decently well in San Francisco, but being able to live in the city or even close to the city is a challenge, and we worry about that from a crisis response standpoint and a public safety standpoint. And I
you
think
want
that's
your
changed
police
over
officers
there.
and
You want
firefighters living in the community
sure.
that they serve,
And we certainly still do have many, but that's an increasing challenge. And I do think sometimes if we say, are we the worst, or is it, I think we simultaneously have an intense housing crisis. It's really at the level of a catastrophe. But for people who do live here who aren't, who are able to stay here, many are hanging on, but it's still a tremendous place to live. It's San Francisco is a great city. The Bay Area is a beautiful place, and so these two things coexist. And I think it almost creates an identity crisis for policymakers and people who live here because they both things are true. It's both a wonderful place and a place that if we don't take really many drastic steps to turn things around, it's not going to stay that way.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, we love it here. It's a
yeah,
phenomenal
it's-
place to
it's-
live, but it creates a set of challenges for folks that can be really daunting, I think. And you just used the word, it's not even a crisis now, it's a catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean, it's a longer word, so, but it's, you know, that's,
We started here at 4 o'clock at a crisis.
But I
now
think
we're at
I think
catastrophe.
most crises,
Time to put it up,
most crises have a time limit, and this is it's a long-standing crisis, and I think it almost becomes just something that people say all the time. But what are we doing? That's why we're here. That's what we're talking about. But it's the language is almost inadequate to
Right,
describe
sure.
what we're.
No, we
what
may
we're
be heading
dealing
toward
with.
calamity soon. if
Yeah,
that's worth it.
I mean,
But I would say on the, silver lining side of the ledger that, these last couple of years with the crisis and the way that people are summoning their engagement at the corporate level, at the millennial level, it is something, just the fact that presidential candidates are talking about it, as you said, is so heartening and completely different than anything I've seen in the 30+ years I've been involved in this work. So it gives me some hope that that there's a pathway, that there's a way.
Well, I mean, I think
Yeah.
to offer that same sense of optimism, we have the best and the brightest in the Bay Area, and we're blessed with a great economy and lots of talented people. We'll figure a way out of this. I mean, there is a way, and we
But
just have to have a focused approach and really get it done.
Right, and we need everybody leaning in, and it is a resource issue to some extent. So
Sure.
I think not only putting the Google dollars and the Facebook dollars, but also aligning the resources and leveraging them, and that's where the regional planning approach is so important, because you can put money in a single project on this property, but you really need to be looking at the systemic ways in which we finance and build housing.
And I would add to that too, a sort of a patience for iterating on this, because there's so many things that need to happen to really address the crisis, and it may not always be right first out of the gate, right? Like we're trying to, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like,
Right,
let's
right.
see what works, and if it doesn't mean, well, throw our hands up, that policy's out the door. It's like, okay, what did we learn? How do we make that
And let's
better?
not have paralysis.
Right, that there
Right,
really has to be
analysis.
some appetite for action, even if it's like, well, that wasn't exactly where we wanted to go, but we learned how to make it better, so now let's keep
I
working.
feel better every day. I live in the East Bay, and I go past, I'm on BART, I go past MacArthur BART station, and I look at that beautiful, tall apartment complex being built right next to the station, which could never have happened. 22 stories,
Right.
I think, something,
Right.
and could never have happened before. And, the Yimbys were involved in this. They actually went to the Oakland City Council and demanded approval of something that historically would have been killed. And so, we do that enough times over, and we lose, if we could lose a little bit of the angst we have over height, because we did build the region flat.
Right.
And if we could get over that, not everywhere, but where
Where it makes sense.
where it
That's
makes
such a
sense,
fear
I
of
think.
change. People just naturally, I think, sort of resist a change in direction. You mentioned, Mary Ann, Google and Salesforce and some of these mega companies in the Bay Area which are providing so many of these terrific jobs. What responsibility, if they have any responsibility, maybe some would argue, hey, their responsibility is we build a successful company, we hire a lot of people. What responsibility do they have to be a part of this solution in a real way?
They have a huge responsibility, I think. I mean, and then I think you hear this from more and more, elected officials and policymakers, because, the success of the region is part of what's driving their growth and their success. And I
But
think
they would
we're-
argue the success is being driven by the fact that they
I mean, I
open
think
businesses.
that most of the companies are seeing more and more of a sort of shared opportunity and priority to try to focus on getting more housing built. And it is remarkable to see some of these of commitments, but it does need to be broader. And I think, it's not just about helping on housing; it's about making sure that there are opportunities for across the the breadth of the workforce, and making sure that they have diverse workforces, and I think we see greater commitments, but there needs to be even more. But we have partnerships with some of the companies sometimes to work on particular issues. But
do we reach, Judson, a tipping point where we ask too much of them and they decide, you know what, they're not making us do this in Austin, we'll just go there.
I think that's always an issue with business location. Jim can speak to that more. But I think that I think in most cases we're not approaching that that really, but it does become a decision. I mean, in San Francisco we have the office space is an incredible demand, and that's a big challenge, and that's you're seeing a lot of office growth in Oakland and other parts in San Jose and other places in part because of that. But yeah, I think it does get back to a little bit that we can take things for granted, but I think we need to make sure that we have a shared commitment to taking on these challenges.
I think the companies have a huge opportunity right now to sort of shift the headlines about that industry, and by demonstrating that they are part of building a better Bay Area, that they're really stepping into this space, and whether it's engaging in training to have a diverse workforce and tapping into younger people coming up in the Bay Area who are not currently on a pipeline to get into those industries, or really stepping into the housing space. I mean, if they can be part of shifting this dynamic and that becomes a news story, that's all upside for the people who live here, but it's also upside for those companies as well, as they increasingly are identified with this place.
The
Real
trend is,
incentive for
these
them.
are our members. The trend is positive. They realize that this is an issue for them. They also have to recruit and retain, and housing is a huge issue for these companies. And so they're trying a lot of different things. Some of them work and some of them don't. Google just committed $1 billion to housing, and they're trying to actually get at scale permitted.
Jim, what does that look like? Forgive the interruption, then get back to your thought. What does $1 billion committed to housing look like? Where does that money go? How is it used? What's the?
Well, it goes to underwrite. It goes to underwrite affordable housing to a degree, because that's part of the commitment that they make. They put some money into homeless prevention and services, so to support the community, and then it goes directly into development of combination of mixed-use development, market rate housing, and so forth.
So they literally say, you're building some mixed-use housing, here's a check, here's part of the money.
Yeah, and they partner with folks to do it, and what's happening, I think, in the commercial world like that is it's becoming part of the mix of what companies do. So before, where they built office buildings and support facilities for their employees, it's now becoming, housing is entering the mix. And it's new. Some companies are doing it, some companies are looking at it. Kaiser Permanente, which is a large growing company, invested $200 million, a few months ago. So, I think we're going to see more and more announcements like this. What I'd like to see is more of a coming together around it and a more strategic, collective approach. Of course, I run an association that has these folks as members, and this is a top issue. So, they're also asking us from a policy perspective, how can we be more successful? Because at the end of the day, they won't solve this, and they shouldn't have to. It's what we as a
It's not
region,
solely their responsibility.
No, and again, you could put a lot of money into something, but if you can't get, if you approach a city and say, we want to redevelop this corridor, and we have land available, and even if we control the land, you still have to get a city council to agree to do this, and in some period of time that's reasonable, not 5 years from now, but
Are companies doing this in other parts of the country as well, where they are assisting with housing and?
They are. Microsoft announced a
Yeah,
$500 million fund in a combination of
In
pre-development
Seattle.
lending activities, yes, in Seattle. But I think Jim's absolutely right. It's in recognition of having a continuation of all the benefits of a really truly more equitable community, and the benefits of allowing a range of folks to continue to live in this area. They're going to need to do something, and then housing their own workforce. So Facebook is building out a campus. Google intends to build on their land. Stanford is offering money up in exchange for being able to expand their footprint and build on campus. So there's a lot of things going on.
All right, as you well know, if you're watching on Facebook, our web page, or on our YouTube channel, you're listening to a town hall meeting where we have a panel of experts focused on the issues surrounding the housing crisis in the Bay Area. We know from our reporting that so many of you are concerned about this on a daily basis. We all have friends who have trouble making ends meet. We all have friends and neighbors who have left the Bay Area because it's just too expensive. And some of us have friends who have been forced out of their homes and live on the streets as a result. Dan Ashley from ABC 7 News with you. Let me encourage you to reach out on our Facebook page if you have a question, if you're listening to this discussion. I'm going to reintroduce our panelists. because they're just terrific, and I want you to be able to tap into their knowledge. Ken Kirky, on my left here, Planning Director with the Association of Bay Area Governments. Elizabeth Kneebone, the Research Director, UC Berkeley Turner Center for Housing Innovation. Marianne Leshin is the Deputy Director of Housing and Community Development in Oakland. Marianne's had some terrific things to talk about that have been going on in Oakland. Jim Wunderman, on my right here, CEO of the Bay Area Council. And then Judson True, the Director of Housing Delivery in San Francisco, newly created position by Mayor London Breed, focused on really trying to address the severe shortage of housing in San Francisco. And finally, Cynthia Parker, the President and CEO of Bridge Housing. Bridge Housing operates here in the Bay Area and in some other communities as well. It's a nonprofit housing developer. Thank you all again for being with us.
Good to be here.
We have a question now from, so please, let me hear from you if you have a question. Will fixed income housing for seniors be addressed anytime soon? Well, it has been addressed somewhat, but what are we doing with respect to fixed income housing?
So on the, San Francisco has a affordable housing bond, $600 million. It's on the ballot this November. And of that $600 million, I believe about $150 million is dedicated towards senior housing, and that will cover both seniors up to 80% AMI and some seniors paying 30% of rent of income at a fixed rent. So that's been a priority by San Francisco, and I think that's going to be the most significant new funding stream for specifically senior housing in some time if the voters approve that measure.
Elizabeth, the number of seniors who are now homeless has gone up dramatically, has it not, in the last few years?
Yes, I think
Is that the fastest growing number
I'm
of
not
homes?
actually sure. You may know from your recent study.
Yeah, I would have to refer back to it.
Yeah.
But it
But-
is
but it-
definitely a growing
it's a growing
number,
concern,
and we
and
expect it to grow more.
Yeah, and with the sort of silver tsunami that's coming as the boomers age, I think that's an increasing concern about people living on fixed incomes. And I would say not even just being able to have affordable housing, but is it the appropriate housing for a senior trying to age in place, especially as we think about more car-centered communities. Again, where there's a lot of demand for housing, and that you have a few different issues going on. Is there a
Right.
place for seniors to move so they don't have to be so car-centric, so they get the services that they need but can remain in their community, while also opening up housing stock that may be big enough for families that's being underutilized right now because there's not an affordable option to allow that
I see.
homeowner to move out of. So there are a lot of interrelated issues there, I think, to address.
This is a bit of an aside. Part of it's funny, but part of it makes a real point. I love to comment. I was on vacation not long ago. We tend to lose sight of how expensive things are in the Bay Area because we get used to it. I was on vacation a couple weeks ago in Florida, and my brother and his partner, and we rented 4 bicycles. I rented 4 bicycles to go pedal around on this little island. How much is it for 2 hours? I don't even think they got my ID. You just go in. How much do you think that might cost? $7 a bike. That'd be $150 here for 2 hours, $28. And as we pedaled along in 95-degree heat in Florida, it was my brother's partner, my girlfriend, and I, and we went to, stopped into a grocery store, and I went in to get drinks. And I come out with 3 sports drinks, good size, and a big water for everybody. How much do you think that would be? I mean, that'd be $12, $15 here. It was $4.86. Yeah, $4.86. I mean, that's a pretty. It's a small little example of what we deal with here. That, to the point of pricing everyone out, it's not just the cost of housing. It's the cost of insurance. It's the cost. I bet my housing and car insurance would be a third of what it is in other places, or less. It's everything is expensive. So it's not just housing that prices us out.
In the poll that we did that shows, virtually 50% of the population of the Bay Area considering a move to some other region, the main reason that's identified is the cost of living. And of course, within that, housing is the biggest driver, but it isn't just housing. This is a very expensive
Groceries are
place
more
to live.
expensive.
Insurance, everything is more.
That's just fascinating. So sometimes I think, I don't know what we do about that, but it isn't just the cost of housing. Everything costs us more. I mean, I imagine our phone bill and our cable bill is more here than it would be other places too. Interesting where that tipping point is, where it just becomes too expensive unless you're, a super earner. Well, I want to ask a question here from Jeff Bowen, one of our viewers. How does the region begin addressing the housing shortage without severely impacting the second most urgent problem in the Bay Area, and that is traffic?
So those things need to be done together. You know, they're really one set of issues. You know, housing and transportation, and you know that's what we work on. And you know, one of the things that we're trying to do with a number of other groups, you know, right now is fashion up the largest investment in transportation we've ever seen in the Bay Area. Something similar to what was done in LA a few years ago. You know, LA raised in a couple of measures in a row about $120 billion, rebuilding their light rail system, you know, really trying to move that city off the car, and not just the city, but the county as well, you know, into mass transit and making it, you know,
Tough to do in
viable.
LA, I would think.
It's tough, but you know, at some scale, they're actually doing it.
Really?
And they're, you know, and they have the Olympics coming, and they're, you know, they need to be able to do this. So, you know, what we've been able to do in the Bay Area is we've passed a lot of county measures. Unlike LA, which is one county, we've got 9 in the
Right.
historic region. And so a lot of the counties have passed sales tax measures, probably raised about $40 billion that we've spent on various projects, and I think we've made a lot of improvements, but we haven't been able to get, you know, these large regional projects invested in at scale that could actually, we still about 2/3 of all trips that people take in the Bay Area are single occupant vehicles and cars.
Oh,
And
sure.
for a region like this, that's just way too high compared to regions around the world, LA aside. And so, you know, that should be well less than 50%. And if it was well less than 50%, you know, Jeff, we wouldn't have this kind of traffic. Now, we've got other, you know, we've got technology that we intend to apply to this. We want our transit agencies to work better together. We have a lot of agencies that have different fare schedules, you know, different ways of operating that need to work, you know, much better in tandem. You know, we have to deliver projects in better ways than perhaps we've done in the past. So, you know, we're trying to build a movement to see if we can't get on the ballot in November in 2020 to give the folks in the Bay Area the opportunity to vote for this. And I have a feeling at the same time they would be voting for subsidies for housing. And so my hope is we could maybe do this in a 1-2 punch and say to the folks in the Bay Area, kind of enough is enough, you know, let's solve this. And, you know, we've polled on it, and what we find is that, you know, generally speaking, you know, about 2/3 of the population is ready to do something big.
Really?
And so, you know, the question, you know, this is not easy to do, and to, you know, get before the voters in a way that people can feel good about it. And, you know, folks like yourself, you know, journalists say, you know, not only is this the right thing to do, but they're doing it right. But we have to address the traffic and transportation.
Well, it's all interrelated, isn't it? And you know, and we
100%.
talk about creating transit villages and using that land around BART and other
Right.
facilities to really house more people and allow them to benefit from mass transit. But I hear we've done a lot of reporting in our Building a Better Bay Area series on BART. And I have to say, I take BART periodically, and I've always liked BART, but I hear from people all the time, that every time I get on a BART train, there's something. I'm hassled, there's some scary guy on there. The experience has changed somewhat, and people don't feel particularly safe on BART.
I think that, I mean, transportation and housing are inextricably linked. I mean, the Bay Area, the transportation system to a large extent is about getting people from the east to the west in the morning and back home again in the afternoon and evening, because so many of the jobs tend to be in the west, and so much of the more affordable housing is in the east. And BART's ridership has increased roughly 50% in 10 years. At the same time, the system is aging out. Fortunately, a lot of the rail cars are about to be replaced, but they've reached a critical point where the system is old and it needs to be rebuilt. And that's come at the same time that it's had tremendous growing pains. And Caltrain is somewhat similar. The freeway system, all of it.
It's kind of all coming
There's
to
a
a
way
head
in
at once.
yes, and there's a way in which the jobs housing piece and the location piece is so important. I think the transportation piece is critical. We need a better network. We need a transportation and transit system that's much more seamless. Riders don't care if they're on BART or Caltrain or Muni. They just want to get someplace and they want it to work. But we also need to better align where we're building housing and where the jobs are, because the transportation system cannot just play catch up.
Right.
It isn't possible.
We're also looking in this measure to make transportation costs more equitable for people who are of less means or who have been pushed to the ends of the region because, their transportation costs are really high. They moved from Oakland, maybe to Antioch, and now, we've actually extended BART to Antioch, so we've given them an option, but it's expensive. So, we're gonna look at ways.
But it's great to have it out that far.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And, I think we've built a lot of projects. I think there's a lot to be proud of, but there's so much more that has to be done. We have to span the bay, probably with Caltrain, probably with BART again, Dumbarton Crossing. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity to improve our systems. The SMART train operating in the North Bay is now, in operation. People are using it, and there's some expansion opportunities there as well. So, what we need to do as a region is think through what are the highest, best uses of money. We can't do everything, but at least approach this at scale, and really give it a shot, because and use the transportation infrastructure that we have as places to create new nodes for housing, and really get behind making that happen. The electrification of Caltrain is a project that's underway. It's going to bring Caltrain from a few years ago, 27,000 riders a day, up to about 200,000 riders a day. And once it's connected to the Transbay terminal, and it will be someday, this could be a measure to help fund
It's
that.
all such a staggering amount of money, though, isn't it? The cost of the new BART trains, for example, electrifying Caltrain, the high-speed rail project that has just gone through the
But
roof.
it's
I think the important thing is-
generational opportunity. So this is something we need to think about for the next century. So just
And the cost will be greater if we don't do it. I think that's what one of the reasons we're paying more now is because we don't have as robust of a transit system, because we didn't, because
But the cost would be much less had we done it 10 years ago,
yeah,
20
I mean,
years ago.
that's pretty much always true. But I mean, there were counties that are not part of the BART system, so we've had to come up with other systems for that. But I think, I think that we have to think big and have that kind of vision. And housing and transportation are absolutely linked. We see that in San Francisco as well. But in San Francisco as a city itself, it's not just about cars or even public transportation. It is about biking and walking and other modes, the other kinds of transportation that are coming up, and we have to make sure that we design our city to have all of those modes interacting together.
Anyone else want to jump on that?
And finally, let me speak for ferries. We're expanding the ferry system. I'm on board of the ferry system, and every month is our highest passenger count. Every month.
Is that really true, Jim? You've seen it growing up?
We're up to now about 3+ million passengers a year, and we have a lot of new boats, and we're growing that system. So that's part of the mix. That won't solve our whole problem, but you have to take a look at every possible transit mode. And for a lot of people who live closer to the waterfront, water transit offers a lot of opportunity, and people actually
It's kind of a pleasant
enjoy their
experience.
transportation
Sure.
experience.
As we look at the development of the southern bayfront in San Francisco, really from Mission Rock south of the Giants ballpark, down to all into Brisbane, we see a lot of opportunities for water transit there, as we add thousands of housing units in that part of the city.
I know a number of people take the ferry and love it.
And
They
they love
enjoy
it.
it. Yeah,
And there used to be 10, 20 times as many people riding the ferry.
Used to be at one time 50 million people a year before we built the bridges.
What?
When we built the bridge, yes, 50 million people, because that was the way you
That was
crossed
the-
the bay.
that's how you
by the
crossed the bay.
bridges. When we built the bridges, we required in the law the elimination of the ferry system back in the 1930s, because the bondholders required in the codicil of the bonds, they didn't want to have to compete with water transit. So we eliminated ferries, and they just started
That
coming
was,
back in the 1960s.
short-sighted.
And it's, we're working our way back.
Right.
There used to
but-
be rail on the Bay Bridge too.
Yeah, that's right.
Well,
That's right, they did.
Yeah,
years ago.
Jesus.
Well, one more tool in the transportation toolkit, of course, are buses, and in Oakland we are moving along with the BRT, the bus rapid
Yes.
transit along International Boulevard, which is our kind of effort to
Is that expanding or?
Yeah, it's right now it's making its way. I think the last phase moving into downtown is about to embark. But I think the key is it's another opportunity to get people out of their cars, but it also needs to be coupled with the housing, and to the extent that affordable housing funding sources are incentivizing housing around these transit, and I think the definition of transit is growing to accommodate the different kinds of transportation options that people are, cities are being able to bring to the table.
Okay, interesting. And so our definition of transit is really changing. So not just, it's all of it now.
Right.
It's
So
bicycles, it's.
right. So for example, when housing developments look at the ability to compete for funds, and if you have proximity to BART, it was more limited. It was
Right.
certain kinds of transportation.
Now
it's
we're
the
thinking broader.
definitions
All
of
right,
that.
let me pause for a moment. I've got about 30 seconds. Thanks, Josh. For those of you watching on Facebook, YouTube, and on our website, if you've been with us for any length of time, you know the drill here. I'm going to pause for a moment because I'm going to go on ABC 7 News at 6 o'clock, where I would normally be, but I'm here doing this with you, and it's been a fascinating discussion. Please send in your questions to our Facebook page with these experts while we have a little time left with them. I'm going to pause for a moment so I can make sure I hear when Larry and Amma come to me. So talk amongst yourselves for just a moment.
Which do you like doing better, this or that?
Minute 30? Yep, you got it.
You like doing the news better, or you like doing stuff?
Oh, I love doing this. I love it all, but I love the chance to. One of my favorite things to do is be in conversation with people. Here we go. Hi, Amma. Hey, Larry. We're having just a great discussion here for the last couple of hours about all of the things surrounding the issue of the housing crisis that we report so extensively on in our efforts to build a better Bay Area. It is a complex problem. We're not solving the problem here today, but I can tell you this discussion is helping us develop a much deeper understanding of the various implications of this problem and how to address it. I have a terrific panel of experts who have just been absolutely outstanding, and I want you to hear from them. Jim Wunderman is the CEO of the Bay Area Council. Jim, we have just a few seconds. We were talking before we came on television here about the connection between transportation issues in the Bay Area and the housing crisis. Spend a moment on that.
Transportation and housing are inexorably linked. People oppose housing because they fear greater traffic, and so we have to work on both at the same time. They both require a lot of money. They both require new approaches. People want new ways of doing things better, faster, and more meaningfully. So, and housing needs to attach to transportation so that people stop using their cars. Today, about 2/3 of every trip that people take in the Bay Area is in a single occupant vehicle, and it's just too much. And I think we all agree, that that's something we can focus on and make better by having better transportation and housing that's located where people can use it.
And I think Jim used the figure earlier about every day about 200,000 people commute here from the Central Valley because it's too expensive for them to live here. That only adds to the transportation problem. So it's all interlinked. Thank you very much, Jim, and all of you. Please, I want you to hear from these panelists. Go to our Facebook page, send in your questions. You'll get some terrific and insightful answers. We'll continue here for a time, but Larry and Amma, let's go back to you. Great job, you guys. Okay, thank you. So we'll continue now. Thank you for those of you online for your patience in letting us break for television. Please make sure you send in your question to us. This question comes from Iris. Maybe companies need to look at how they can assist their employees with home subsidies. That's an interesting question, a little bit different than asking a company to contribute to housing, developing moderate income housing and subsidizing housing construction here. Should employers subsidize housing costs for their employees? Should employers rather subsidize their housing costs for their employees? Could that be a benefit? A lot of companies will give you a company car, right?
I mean, I think it's already happening. There's quite a few
Are they?
companies in the region, they're already doing this because they know it is the big obstacle for the employees they want to have in the Bay Area is the cost of housing.
So we'll pay you X in salary plus we'll give you $2,000
We'll
a
cover,
month
we'll
toward
cover
your
your
house.
down payment.
Oh, really? Okay.
You know, or a portion thereof.
But is that
that's
for
a-
executive level positions, or is that
No, I don't, I think it goes further, you know,
down?
a wider range of positions than
Well,
just
I did
executive.
talk to a certain owner of one of the Bay Area sports teams. I won't mention which one, and he told me that their assistant coaches make a modest good incomes, but
They're not millionaires.
seven-figure incomes, and so they typically move around from city to city, and in order to keep assistant level coaches, he has to augment their housing. Have to maybe buy a house for them in order to
Buy a
keep-
house.
buy a house and let them live in it. In fact,
Was this, I know you didn't want to mention it, did this team recently win a championship? Do they use a round ball, an oblong ball?
But I have a feeling it applies to not just to that team, but to not just all the teams. But this is what we're seeing in businesses, that where they can afford to do it. The problem is some companies can afford to do this, and some companies
some
can't,
can't,
to do
right.
it where they're lower margin businesses, small business, and so forth. So it's probably a really good opportunity where it can work, but it's not the solution to the overall
On
problem.
the subject of small businesses, because we've been talking a lot about the mega businesses around here that bring in so many employees with so many high-paying jobs, and I know a lot of these folks. There are a lot of people who have small businesses. Maybe I own a postal annex type business, or a small restaurant, or I have a small company we manufacture, and I've got 40 employees. They will tell you it's harder and harder and harder for them to stay in business because it's gotten so expensive. And what would you say to them? Because in order to get an employee that can afford to live here, they've got to pay a good wage. The insurance costs are high. Everything is expensive. How much pressure are we putting on those type of businesses, which are really, in so many respects, the backbone and collectively the largest employer in the country, are these small businesses?
And in San Francisco, our neighborhood commercial corridors are what provide us with so much character. It's not just about the same brands you see everywhere. It's there are differences in the different neighborhoods. And I think one point I think, well, first of all, it's obviously, that's why we're talking about this, because it's such a struggle for anybody to afford living in the Bay Area. So small businesses would be especially impacted. But another thing is, as shopping patterns have changed, as retail has changed and moved, in some cases online more, it still would help to have more foot traffic from slightly denser housing developments in some of these neighborhoods. And I think they should see those new potential housing units as new customers,
As an opportunity.
As an
Interesting.
opportunity. And again, shopping is changing, retail is changing. Restaurants, people are going to keep going out to eat, and there are businesses.
There's a
that-
good housing guy sales pitch, right?
Yeah, there are businesses that will continue to need to be physically located in our neighborhoods. Hopefully, many of them. And I do think we see a lot of activity. I live in sort of the edge of Hayes Valley, Western Addition, and that neighborhood has seen tremendous new housing development on the former freeway parcels, both market rate and affordable developments. And you see just a tremendous amount of foot traffic in the neighborhood, creative retail spaces in the next to Patricia's Green there, and it's also it is an expensive neighborhood, which is unfortunate, but there is a lot of commercial activity that's come from having more new residents.
Okay. Anybody else want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, just to the small business point, I think you're right. When I hear stories about employers doing something about housing, it's tech companies or larger companies who can offer a housing stipend for interns coming in for the summer, or down payment assistance for their
They have a lot
full-time
of
staff.
money.
Right, but I wonder if there are other. Outside of California, there are other models that have evolved. Like Illinois has an employer-assisted housing tax credit at the state level, which could help smaller businesses because it works through the state. Like, they're able to work with states to get their employees basically into housing that's either closer to where they work or that's closer to transit. That's how the program has been designed. And that's something that could work with employers of all
Is
sizes.
that seen to be effective in Illinois? Is that?
I believe so. Yeah,
From
I
what
mean,
you
it's for the employers who make use of that program. It is helping them to get their employees into stable housing. I think the impetus of that was shorter commutes and happier workers who are more productive because they can afford to live or work, live near where they work or have an easy commute to where they work. So
Yeah, I think we probably all know people who commute an hour and a half a day, 2 hours a day sometimes, and you feel for them because there's a lot of their life is being spent in a car or commuting in some way. It's not easy. I want to go back a little bit more and talk about kind of a focus on solutions. As we look regionally, locally, however you want to tackle it, if you were to prioritize decision 1, decision 2, decision 3, to really make headway on this problem, so that when we meet here a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, we can honestly say the housing crisis has eased. What would those decisions be?
No, I would say, we haven't mentioned Governor Newsom, but he's, made a commitment to build 3.5 million homes in California, which is what we need. And he's talked about providing a package, and there's a bill that covers this, I guess AB 101, that has a package of incentives, carrots and sticks, if you will. So there are fines for cities, in effect, that don't perform according to their requirements of how much housing they're supposed to build, but there's also incentives as well provided to cities that do. And so I think, we talked about Prop 13 being sort of underlying this earlier, but changing that mix, having cities look at this differently, because that's where the action is. Ultimately, housing gets permanent, housing is the result of somebody who wants to build it and a city that's willing to allow it. And that's kind of the scale. Second, I would say is, really push on the accessory dwelling units, because you can build a lot of affordable housing there on existing property without really impacting neighborhoods, and
not
people
huge
seem
expense.
to really accept this quite a bit. So I think those two things would be really impactful. And although we won't solve this problem overnight, just showing all of us that we're on the right track, we're making it happen, is I think really what we can do right now, is kind of giving the community hope that there are better days ahead for this.
Yeah, I think that it's a number of things. I think, Jim, you're right. The question really is, what can we put on the table and really open our minds to see what will solve this problem? We're talking about the need for 3+ million new homes, but the land use in the state of California won't accommodate that kind of development. It's about 1 million short. So we're going to need to see some land use changes, maybe some different massing, different density in some communities.
So just, Cynthia, be clear, you're saying that there just isn't enough land to...
There's the land, it's not zoned properly.
I see. There's a
So
zoning
the
issue.
land use needs to be changed in order to accommodate that, and that's going to take some community acceptance. I do think that there are new tools that we ought to revisit or visit and bring in from other communities like Illinois. The employer-assisted housing program is something that we ought to be thinking about in California. When I was in Seattle, the city of Seattle did adopt an employer-assisted housing program, and we actually created sort of a partnership with a bank that provided below-market interest rate loans to get people in, and there was a for-profit fund created, or philanthropy created, to provide down payment assistance for people, so that the
Was it
police and the
effective,
teacher-
Cynthia, to
Oh
work?
yeah, absolutely. We created about 12,000 homes that way.
Really? In what period of time? Just curious.
Oh, that was probably over about an 8-year period, but that was significant when you
Sure.
think about it. And so it's a lot of little drops. Teacher housing, the state of California has done a lot to accommodate new teacher housing. Mayor Breed did introduce this ordinance, this change in the charter, which would have provided by right zoning for teachers and other workers in the city. That has not yet moved, but that is a change in thinking. So it's going to have to be a number of things that make this difference. And it won't be any one silver bullet. It will be the collective thought and people willing to say, we want to do things different. I don't want to leave without saying one thing. I've mentioned this earlier, but now that we're live, I do want to say that we've created a system to create affordable housing that is so complex that it is not just the land use that delays us. It's getting the money together in order to create the subsidy sources. So to create an affordable housing unit, sometimes my staff has to assemble stacks of different types of money, all with different regulations attached to them, sometimes up to 14 different sources
For one project.
for one project.
And just and thumbnail, where are those? What are those sources? Just give us
Well,
examples
the
so we
state of
understand.
California has been very generous recently and has passed a lot of bills, but they have different programs that have been passed that have different strings attached to them, and they are not releasing their monies on a coordinated basis. So some funding sources might come out in 1 month, wait 6 more months to get another one. You have to wait the next funding round to get another one. So it might take 3 years to be able to assemble the capital to build housing. And
Which by
that's-
then the cost of building that housing has gone up.
Absolutely. So one of the approaches that might be useful for the state of California and even the localities to consider is coordinating all of their notices for funding availability so that you could release it out in a super notice of funding availability so that you could get these things funded at once.
Minneapolis, St. Paul does that.
That's
The region
correct.
does it. They have a
Yeah.
single entry.
Yeah,
I mean, we've
was
seen-
gonna,
Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, that was gonna be my number one, was trying to, work across levels of government to accelerate the pace of the development activity, because it just takes so long, as Cynthia's saying, to assemble the different financing sources, not to mention to go through the permitting, entitlement and permitting processes. So I feel like that kind of focus would be a big plus.
Cut the red tape, kind of cut the red tape and move it along.
Right, and it's gonna involve a level of coordination, because no one source, I mean, the idea of having like a single source of affordable housing per project is probably not realistic.
Sure.
But to the extent we can limit the number of sources and align them in a way.
But it doesn't have to be a Rubik's Cube either.
Exactly.
You could also have one, like a regional entity that puts together,
Mhm.
those funding sources and
Kinda
then gets them
gatekeeps.
out, and then, so that there's sort of one initial clearinghouse that then moves out. And there are bills, pending at the state to do, versions of that.
There are. I was going to say that I think there's been a lot of activity in Sacramento, more than there has been in years over the last couple of years, which I think is very encouraging, and a lot of it's coming from the Bay Area delegation. Without naming particular bills, I think there are bills related to production that are both related to market rate and affordable housing that would make it easier to get housing built, which are it's just really, really important. At the end of the day, if it isn't somewhat easier, it's not going to change.
What are these bills, not the number, but what is it they focus on to make it easier? What do they?
Some of them get to issues of what is by right, what can actually get built, and how quickly the process, how quickly the development process proceeds. And they try to pull some of the red tape out of the process if a project meets certain criteria. That would be a big change in the state of California. That would help. I think protection is also really important given the downward pressure that extremely low income households in this region face in this housing climate. If there are some bills, and there's some in the legislature right now that provide some sorts of protection, that could be helpful to folks who are most vulnerable. And then it takes money. And Jim spoke to the likelihood that there may be some bills on the next presidential election, perhaps. At the end of the day, to get the more affordable housing built, some of it, we haven't had a good subsidy for the stack of capital that's needed for affordable housing since we lost redevelopment. There are smaller pots that have been created since redevelopment, but we're still missing the subsidy, which can be a pretty small part of the stack, but it's a critical part of the stack. And if that was funded, that could really help with extremely very low income housing, and that I think would make a really big difference. I think those things, if those were done over a couple of years, for a lot of people in the Bay Area, they would see some quick wins, and they think, maybe this isn't
Hey,
hopeless.
there's light at the end of the tunnel.
We can actually
We
make
do it.
progress on some of these issues.
I think along with the idea that we need more subsidy, we need better alignment of those subsidies, better alignment of the ground conditions in communities, which is what
Yeah.
you're talking to, right, to smooth the process and pave the way for production. It's also like the cost of building, which we've talked about, being able to address that so that the subsidy can go further would be really meaningful. And it's tough because that cost stack on a project involves so many different levers, from local development fees to other sorts of things that layer on top. But the bulk of it is hard costs, right? It's materials, it's labor. So thinking about ways that innovation could be brought to bring some of those costs down, like we've seen a lot more done in the modular space, off-site construction that can happen year-round and then be brought to the site and built. Like there are opportunities in the construction process where technologies could help potentially smooth timelines, increase productivity, and bring down costs. And that paired with more investments could really make a meaningful
Be a powerful
change.
combination.
Yeah.
Robert sent in this question. How about requiring new construction of office buildings to require them to make the top floors include housing? Now, whether it's top floors, bottom floors, but the point being, we already do that to some degree. Should we do a little bit more in requiring businesses to create housing even in an office building? Does that make any sense?
Some cities are doing that in their own way. I don't know that they're doing exactly the way that the viewer described, but Mountain View, for example, North Bay Shore, a portion of that city, for quite a while there was a proposal to redo the office park as essentially an office park, and then the community took a much deeper dive, and they now have a plan for a neighborhood, and they're going to build a neighborhood there.
In addition to the office, no office park.
There will be offices, there will be commercial, there will be schools, there will be a lot of housing. It'll actually become a place as opposed to a 1950s, 1960s office park, which is what it has been. That's a really, really big change, and I think it's intended to do exactly what the viewer is suggesting, of really bringing these things together. And I think for that community, it's creating a place where people will want to live, and it's provides a lot of benefits for the people who've lived there for a long time.
One thing I think that's worth pointing out is that most in San Francisco, and I think in some other cities in the Bay Area, and I think this is going to be a broader Bay Area wide conversation, there are what's called jobs housing linkage fees. So if a developer is going to build an office building, then they have to pay a certain amount per square foot to pay for housing, and that fee is has a significant source of funding in San Francisco, where we're looking at significant new office growth in Central Soma neighborhood. There's going to be tens of millions of dollars, really hundreds of millions over time for housing from those office developments. And we do also see some buildings that will mix a little bit of office or residential and office, but that's usually it's not usually the case.
It depends a lot on what part of the Bay Area you're building. So if you're in San Francisco charges a fee to a commercial developer for every slice of life imaginable, that supports the overall community, because they can, because the value of being able to build an office building, and charge today $90 a foot or $100 a foot rent. But if you have a city that's dying to get some jobs in it, and and somebody wants to come in and build an office building, they'd be unlikely to. Even if they're a city that hasn't produced much housing, I think they'd be more resistant to wanting to charge a fee, because they might lose the development opportunity, because the price per foot in that might be way less than half. So, it depends on the market. But in general, the notion that that there is some relationship here is good. Not whether you mix it in the building or you build a community.
Right. But the concept
is a good idea.
And you've seen at least a couple of cases I could think of retail with housing above,
Sure.
such as in San Jose, Santana Row, and then in Emeryville at Emery Bay.
Walnut Creek, they're doing that quite a bit.
So it seems to be a model that's
How
successful.
challenging is it to change thinking in not just among residents, but even developers and builders and politicians, to really change thinking to be more creative and do things in a non-traditional way?
I think in crisis there is opportunity for that. Absent that crisis, it's very reticent to move. So right now we do have the moment to really think differently in order to create things. You mentioned retail. Another opportunity are some of these failed malls. We're actually working with a partner who's looking at old Sears stores. Not so much in urban dense areas, but all the Sears went out of
Suburban?
business.
Yeah.
Suburban, and there's a lot of vacant square footage out there.
And what are they thinking about?
Converting it. I
Good.
mean, we would probably do some housing out there.
Really interesting. In that existing space. just-
Correct. Yep.
Sun Valley Mall, maybe, to help.
So you would take just a 1 or 2 story giant 30,000 square foot
building, sure.
yeah, and tilt up constructed building and parcel it off and make it an apartment unit?
Yes.
Conceivably?
Yes. I
Interesting.
mean, we've been penciling some of this out. Some work better than others. It just really depends on the age of when it was built. You know, does it have hazardous materials inside?
Sure.
But again, thinking differently, and cities are going to have to think differently about those old retail malls, because not everybody, retail shopping is very, very different than it used to be.
Very much so.
I think to kind of add to that, I think your question is a priority. That we've been talking about priorities and solutions. One solution is to, get more support for getting more housing built. I mean, that's one of the solutions that we need over time. And I think that's telling the stories of people who are able to live in these new homes. I mean, I think we talk about housing units, and it sounds very technical, and it's just imagined as this empty physical space, and it's a home for
Right.
people. And that's true of the over 7,000 affordable homes we built in San Francisco in the last 4 years, and it's true of market rate housing as well, where someone who lives in that new unit on Upper Market Street is not displacing someone who lives in the Mission, for example. And so I think we have to tell those stories of the people who are living in these new homes that are getting built, and also maybe
And
go
show-
back
yeah.
sometimes.
Oh, I was going to say, and show the examples too,
Yeah.
like Cynthia
Yeah.
was talking about, like the high quality housing, and when you can increase
Yeah.
density and show the sort of like how it fits well within the community.
Absolutely. I
Really
mean-
helping to assuage concerns about that this is going to be so, such a shock to the system that it will actually integrate.
7 or 8 years ago, my then housemate and I went to a community meeting about a new supportive housing, building, and it proposed on one of the old freeway parcels in Hayes Valley Western Addition area, and there were neighbors there, arguing about it and objecting, and a few of us spoke up in favor of it, and it got built. It's a beautiful building. There's a bakery in the ground floor that actually has formerly homeless people who work there. That and
Judson,
it's a great part of the neighborhood.
Sorry, let me interrupt
Yeah.
you for a second. We'll go back on TV. For those of you who are watching online, just give us a moment and go back on ABC 7 News in just about 10 seconds. Sorry, Judson. We'll get to
No.
Hi, I'm Larry once again. We're just having the best conversation the last few hours here, really digging deeply into a variety of issues surrounding the housing crisis, and it's very complex. It involves transportation issues. Homelessness is critical and a key part of, sometimes people think they're two separate things, housing and homeless. As we've discussed here today, they are deeply linked. Have a great panel of experts. If you want to go to the Facebook page and ask a question of these experts, I'd love to put that question to them. Very quickly, let me go. Ken Kirky is the planning director with the Association of Bay Area Governments. Ken, we've been talking here a little bit before we went on the air on ABC 7 News about trying to learn to think differently, because these are such critically challenging times here in the Bay Area. How hard is it to get governments to think differently, developers to think differently, ordinary folks who may have developments in their homes think differently and be more creative and be more open to new ideas?
I think it's challenging. I think there are opportunities as well. I mean, I think one of the issues that's built up over time, and Judson just touched on this, that folks who care about housing oftentimes talk about it in terms of numbers. People don't care about numbers if they're in their neighborhood and they care about their neighborhood. They want to know that something new coming into the neighborhood is going to be something that's going to be positive and beneficial. And a lot of that gets to the design issues, that you can have very nice duplexes or triplexes in a neighborhood that in the past may have seen multifamily housing that wasn't so great. And that's the model that they're familiar with, but a different design that really fits within
Could
the
be more
context of the neighborhood
palatable.
could be much more
Okay,
palatable.
all right, great. We are having a really spirited and interesting conversation. I hope you'll join us on Facebook, YouTube, and on our website as well. Love to hear from you, and I'd love the chance to ask our experts one of your questions. So when you can, go to Facebook right now. The conversation will continue here. Thank you all. Larry, we'll go back to you. Thank you, guys. Okay, thank you. That's our last for television. Okay, thank you. All right, for those of you watching online, thank you for your patience as we have to interrupt a little bit, but we also continue the conversation. Let me go back to you, Judson, because I interrupted you before to go to television. Do you want to continue your thought on it?
No, I think it's just about looking at what actually happens when new developments go in, especially affordable developments that maybe people aren't comfortable with, and going back afterwards and having a community meeting where the neighbors meet the residents of those new developments, and really tell the stories of all the people that are being helped, because every one of those new housing units has a resident of that particular community that is contributing to the quality of life in that,
And the
in that
vibrancy
town,
of
and the
that
vibrancy.
community.
And, and I think when we talk about numbers and units and housing, it's separated from the people that make it a home, and I think that's really crucial.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, what I've observed is that, someone mentioned something about the HUD reputation, and, I remember when I was doing housing development, going to a community meeting where the rally cry was, "We don't want any HUD housing." HUD is a 4-letter word, just like really spinning
close-minded
out
about
and
it.
very, very concerned. But that was maybe 20 years ago. I think as the body of excellent work is now in the ground, and not only can people look at, oh, this building was built last year, they can look at buildings that have been in the communities for 20 years or more and see that they're well kept, that these neighbors, that the individuals living there are neighbors, they could be their kids' school teacher. I think that there's really a growing movement towards acceptance. I'm not sure we're all the way there, but I think Justin's story is a good one, and I think that also that historical HUD reputation, maybe I'm trying to be a little Pollyanna here, but younger people don't, it's sort of like that was then that whole sort of public housing fiasco that went on. I mean, the generation that lived through that is aging, and younger people, I think, don't necessarily carry those same
And they
biases.
see things differently. Sure.
Right.
Well, like so many things, we don't deal with them until it becomes a crisis. Look at the conversation we've had in the Bay Area over the last maybe 2 years, particularly about the homeless situation. We've had homeless here forever, but something happened. It changed, and part of it was a different group of people became homeless, so that was shocking to us. And then the numbers escalated so dramatically. Well, now it's a crisis, and now people are turning their attention to it. It was easy to turn the other way for a while. I think the same is true with transportation. It's always been kind of bad here for a long time, but suddenly we've hit this point where it's just, almost unbearable at times. And I think the housing crisis is probably the same. We've all heard people, and we've all complained about the high cost of housing for a long time, but suddenly it's gotten really bad, and so now we have to address it.
And I think what you're doing here is terrific. I think what we've lacked is a cohesive conversation around complex issues, and it allowed for, the lack of communication really allowed for people to sort of play the blame game.
Right.
There's a problem, but I didn't cause the problem. She caused the problem. He caused it, and the solution is to somehow punish them, so that I could benefit or be left alone. And I think what we're seeing now is a bit of a movement toward, a view that we're all in this together, and we all have to participate, and we all have to do some things that make us uncomfortable.
Everybody's got to bend a little bit.
And I think what was done at MTC ABAG, the CASA experiment, to
Right.
bring together leadership from these various communities. And, maybe it wasn't perfect, but I think the notion that we can come together, recognizing we really do have a crisis. I don't think there's much debate about that today, and say, okay, we're really going to tackle this thing, and we're not going to let it go. I think the homelessness issue, people aren't accepting it anymore. I think people are going to demand a solution to this, and it may have to be different than the ways we've approached it before, because of the scale and just recognizing we haven't succeeded. But that doesn't mean we walk away from it. And I think together there's more of a feeling that, okay, we're one region, that can kind of come together and really tackle it.
Well, you know what I think? Thank you for saying that, Jim, because I was thinking as you were speaking, you guys in this industry have these meetings a lot and these conversations, right? But I think what I've learned, what people watching have learned, and this goes out to a lot of people, is how intertwined so many of the issues are. So if you think the housing crisis, hey, my mortgage is affordable, I'm fine. If you don't think it affects you, well, your commute is 15 minutes longer because the housing crisis is that much worse. And the homeless crisis is contributing to that as well. I mean, they're all tied together in a very unique way, and I think if we don't think it affects us directly, we're wrong, probably, because it does in some ways.
I think at a
Agree?
local level, you know, people in a given community in the Bay Area, if they care about this issue and they get involved, it's deeply meaningful for the elected officials in that community that they're involved in that discussion, because most people lead very busy lives, in part getting to and from work and raising their kids and all the rest of it. But that engagement is very important. And I agree with Jim. You know, the CASA process that MTC convened dealt with a very tough issue and therefore was imperfect. There was some criticism about the level of suburban local government involvement. But I think that one of the things that I found particularly just impressive and encouraging was seeing people from very different perspectives representing, you know, market rate developers, social equity advocates, affordable housing developers, foundation representatives, people who may have agreed coming into the process that there is a housing catastrophe, but they didn't agree on the solutions at all, and they may have actually thought his idea is wrong or her idea is wrong, my idea is
The reason this
correct.
happened is that.
And over the course of this process, they really got on the same page of saying, no, we need to move forward on all of these fronts at once. And people who probably never thought they would be advocating for a particular position are doing so, in part because they see that these things are connected and that we need to move forward on multiple fronts to really
Well, what's
turn the
very
corner.
clear is there isn't one or two solutions.
Right.
I mean, one thing won't solve this problem. I think you made that point, Mariana, but it just won't.
Yeah.
One other piece is leadership. I mean, I think, you know, I work for a mayor who grew up in public housing in San Francisco, and, you know, she has, for the, you know, time she's been in public office, and especially the last year she's been mayor, she talks nonstop about all the solutions to homelessness, getting more shelters built, getting more supportive housing built, and the fact that to solve our housing crisis, we need to get more housing built, and that we can't have the politics of no anymore, that we have to figure out ways to say yes to housing to solve the crisis. And I think, you know, for those of us who are working to try to get housing built, having that kind of leadership is crucial, because it puts a wind at our back to fight for the policy changes and the administrative and bureaucratic changes that are going to help us, you know, get the job done over time. And I think I think you can't discount the importance of you know, elected leaders and also, you know, business and nonprofit and policy leaders as well. So that's a big part of the solution.
Well, as we
And research leaders too, academic. I mean,
well,
the Turner Center
data's
provides.
very
The
important.
Turner Center creates papers that turn into to state bills that turn into policies
Yes.
that affect people's lives every day. And that, as you know, somebody who did work on state legislation for a while, you know, having those kinds of research tools
Real
available,
data.
it really matters. I mean, you have data to point to be able to justify
I did a report
tenant
not,
protection or what have you.
not long ago on a think tank that focuses on just the homeless issue. And the goal is to provide policymakers with real data on how many and who and what were the real causes of it. And you know, because sometimes you make assumptions, and that real data is critical. As we begin to wind down, I'd love to kind of go around the horn here and get a sense, because it's a daunting problem, and I know you guys are working day and night to find solutions to it. I wonder if, and try not to be too Pollyanna about it, but I would love to hear your sense of optimism or pessimism. Are you pretty confident that we'll deal with this, or are you concerned? I'll start with you, Ken.
I'm somewhere in between, I would
Yeah.
say. I think, you know, the Bay Area is a phenomenal place, and I think in the past it's been a place that could solve its problems. San Francisco was once known as the city that knows how. I'd like to think this is still a region that knows how. I have a 16-year-old son, and so like many people, this issue is very personal. The measure of success or failure for me will be whether or not, when he gets out of college, if he can afford to live here and make his life here or not,
Right.
if he chooses to. I'd like him to have the opportunity to do
Right.
so.
That's a good litmus test, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
that's very real. Elizabeth?
I mean, I think it's really heartening to see the level of activity and conversation around these issues, that there are so many state bills, that there are so many regional initiatives launching to really engage with this. That CASA process was a big lift of people coming and being very serious about how do we move forward, right? And I think that is all a very positive signal. It's obviously the implementation is the key.
Right.
And the fact that other places are starting to do this, I think that is meaningful too, that Oregon is managing to pass multiple, like a suite of legislation dealing with renter protections and supply side and zoning, that Minneapolis is moving forward with its Plan 20 forward. I think that puts more wind at our backs and actually makes California have to be even more serious about getting this done. Like, there are clearly paths forward because places are doing it. So what can we learn from those experiences that help smooth the path here to implement on things that we know need to happen?
Okay, Marianne.
Well, I feel a sense of hopefulness, but because of all the things we've been talking about, and as I've mentioned, I feel like there is a real sea change in attitude about the issue. This town hall itself is an indication of that.
Agreed, yeah.
I share that with a little bit of a heavy heart because, Ken, I have a 31-year-old son who's actually a construction worker. He did the windows over at MacArthur Bart Housing. Cannot afford to rent an apartment right now. He's an apprentice. So I think that there's a lot that's been lost, in these years of crisis in terms of opportunity and who gets to live in certain places. But that is what it is. So I always have to
Right.
kind of march forward and hope that together in a regional way we can make a difference.
And your kid is a great example.
Yeah.
The young man, it's a skilled job and probably pays reasonably well,
Right.
For the skill. It's not enough to make ends meet. Jim.
Yeah, I think the attitudes have changed, and that makes me feel much more positive, and we've seen it in our voter research where, markedly over the last few years, people are more, understanding that there's a problem and willing to do something about it. And, I think assets like the Turner Center that are really shedding light and, giving us a dose of reality about what it'll take. And, leaders like Mayor Breed, has really been terrific, just standing up on the issue. We need to build all kinds of housing at all levels for all people. Mayor Schaaf, what she's doing in Oakland, Mayor Liccardo, our big city mayors, some smaller city leaders as well. Not all, but more all the time. And so I think the signs are very, very positive.
We're focusing on it in a new way.
Yeah, I see it, and the question is, do we have time? Are we too late?
Right.
And are we going to have
It's
to
like
go
global
through
warming.
a period where where we
Do we
really
have
do
time?
see some thinning out of the region because people just have to leave. They just can't afford this place. So my hope is we're not, and that we can give some signs of hope, to this community that we're on it, and we're making progress. We won't solve it, as you said right at the outset. We don't get to solve this. I wish 3 hours of this. We should have solved it.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Well,
we make strides.
We made some strides, I think, at least in understanding. And Judson, literally your position
Yeah.
with the city is proof that we're focusing on it in a new way. This is a newly created
Yeah.
position.
Yeah, I try to proceed with what I think of as sometimes as a sort of kind of frustrated optimism. So, the optimism that we can do better, and that there are a lot of things that are positive that are happening, and that we have the knowledge and the skills and the passion to do so. Frustration that we're not moving faster, and that some of the existing conditions and recent history has been so damaging to so many communities. But yeah, that frustrated optimism is kind of how I go about every day, trying to get housing delivered in San Francisco.
Keeps you focused, though. Okay,
Yep,
Cynthia.
absolutely.
Well,
Nice word.
I represent an affordable developer, and so we're perennially optimistic. We have to believe that we will get things done, or else they won't happen. Having said that, I feel like we're doing as much as we possibly can. We need to do it faster, better, more, and so we need to figure out how to do that, and it will take us all thinking differently in order to deliver that much more quickly.
Okay. With that, we'll wrap things up. I want to thank all of you from the
you.
bottom of my heart for
Thank you,
coming
Dan.
and
Thank
sitting
you,
here with us
ABC7.
3 hours. Thank you very much for being here. You've been wonderful to sit with us this long and talk and share your knowledge and your ideas. I want to go around quickly and just reintroduce, as we thank Ken Kirky, the Planning Director, Association of Bay Area Governments. Ken, thank you so much for being
Thank you.
here. Elizabeth Kneebone, the Research Director, UC Berkeley Turner Center for Housing Innovation. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for being here. Marianne Leshin, the Deputy Director of Housing and Community Development in Oakland. Thank you for coming, Marianne. Jim Wonderman, CEO of Bay Area Council. Jim, always good to see you. Thank you for being here. Judson True, the Director of Housing Delivery in San Francisco, tasked with getting people into more houses here. Thank you so much for coming in, Judson.
Thank you.
And finally, Cynthia Parker, the president and CEO of Bridge Housing. Cynthia, thank you very much for being here. All of you have been just terrific, and all of you who have tuned in on our Facebook page, our YouTube page, and our website, thank you for being part of this discussion. We hope that it has been valuable and informative. As I said from the outset, we're working to solve the housing crisis today, but we're going to understand it a good deal better, and I think we accomplished that for sure. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you on ABC 7 News at 11 o'clock. We appreciate your being with us. You guys.